Hey guys, tonight we are traveling back to a time when China was not just a country, but an empire of immense power and culture, a civilization whose influence stretched far and wide. Imagine the vast cities alive with merchants, scholars, and artisans, the air rich with the scent of tea, ink, and incense. The rivers carried junks heavy with silk, porcelain, and treasures of every imaginable kind. It was a land where dynasties rose and fell with a rhythm older than memory, yet none could have predicted that a quiet, creeping threat would one day shake this mighty empire to its core. It began subtly, almost innocuously. Foreign merchants arrived on the shores, their ships cutting through the calm waters, carrying goods that dazzled and intrigued. Among the treasures of silk and silver, a new commodity entered the Chinese world, a golden leaf with a promise of euphoria, a promise of escape. They called it opium. To some, it was medicine. To others, a dangerous indulgence. But no one could foresee the scale of its impact, the way it would slowly infiltrate every level of society, and ultimately weaken the very foundations of power and governance. China at this time was governed by an empire that prided itself on order, discipline, and moral authority. The Qing dynasty, with its meticulous bureaucracy, vast armies, and elaborate court rituals, appeared unshakable. Yet, beneath the grandeur, there were vulnerabilities. Trade imbalances had begun to strain the economy, and the desire for foreign silver to balance accounts created openings that cunning traders were quick to exploit. Opium, first introduced as a medicinal novelty, began to spread. What started as small indulgences among the wealthy elite soon reached merchants, laborers, and even government officials. It was a quiet invasion, invisible yet insidious, and soon it was everywhere. The effects on the people were as dramatic as the effects on the empire. Families began to fray, labor productivity dropped, and social unrest started to simmer quietly, like a river swollen after unseen rains. The emperor and his advisors watched in disbelief as reports of addiction multiplied. What could be done against a substance that charmed and enslaved at the same time? Attempts to curb its use led to resistance. Smuggling networks grew more sophisticated, and foreign powers, motivated by profit, were ready to challenge any edict that threatened their lucrative trade. The clash that followed was not just about trade. It was about sovereignty, about control over a society that had thrived for centuries. The Opium Wars were battles not just of guns and cannons, but of culture, economy, and trust. Ports were blockaded, treaties imposed, and humiliations inflicted that shook the emperor's court. Yet the deeper tragedy lay not in the battles themselves, but in the erosion of faith, the slow but relentless corruption that seeped into every corner of governance and society. The empire had been mighty, but even the mightiest structures can crumble when the rot begins unseen. As we drift further into this story tonight, imagine the silent streets of Guangzhou, the dimly lit tea houses where deals were made and lives were changed forever. Picture the rivers at night, the junks silently carrying not just goods, but the promise of destruction disguised as pleasure. And in the emperor's palace, see the weight of responsibility pressing down on men who had long believed that their mandate was eternal, now confronted with a challenge that no army could simply conquer. This is not just a tale of opium, nor merely a chronicle of wars. It is a story of human choices, of vulnerability and pride, of a civilization tested in ways no one could have foreseen. And tonight, as you listen, let yourself wander through the streets and rivers of Qing China. Let the calm narration guide you through the rise and fall, the silent struggles and the powerful currents that shaped history. For in understanding how opium touched every aspect of this empire, from commoners to emperors, we uncover a lesson that echoes across time. Even the strongest walls can be worn down, not by force alone, but by the quiet, relentless pressure of what we underestimate. And so, our journey begins, softly and carefully, tracing the first golden leaves that arrived on Chinese shores, the first whispers of indulgence that spread quietly like smoke. As night deepens around you, picture the empire waking to a new reality, where something small and seemingly harmless would grow into a force capable of toppling centuries of power and pride. The story is long, the story is vast, and the details will unfold gently, like the slow turning of a page in a book older than the mountains themselves. The first golden leaves arrived quietly, hidden among shipments of silver, tea, and silk, almost unremarkable at first glance. Merchants carried them in secret compartments, aware that the empire's laws frowned upon their import, yet enticed by the promise of immense profit. in the bustling ports, where the cries of hawkers mingled with the gentle lapping of the river against wooden docks, these tiny parcels moved through countless hands, each one oblivious to the profound impact they would have. At first, opium seemed like a novelty, a strange and exotic curiosity. Physicians in some provinces experimented with it as a medicine, treating pain, coughs, or digestive disorders. A few aristocrats indulged in its calming effects during long, humid afternoons in their gardens. But the allure of opium was subtle and seductive. It offered a temporary escape from worry, from the endless duties of civil service, from the monotony of daily life under strict social hierarchies. And like all substances that promise relief, it carried with it an invisible, insidious pull. As weeks turned into months, more people began to experiment. Word of its calming and euphoric properties spread quickly, whispered in tea houses and among friends. Soon, those who had tried it once felt compelled to try it again. The addiction was quiet at first. It did not announce itself with loud alarms. A merchant might delay his morning tasks. A scholar might linger over a cup of tea longer than usual. A laborer might steal a moment in a shadowed alley to indulge. Society, as it had always done, carried on. But beneath the surface, a subtle erosion had begun. The empire's officials were slow to recognize the danger. At first, they assumed these were isolated incidents, confined to foreign enclaves or the fringes of society. Reports reached the governor's offices, but they were often dismissed as exaggerations, the result of unfamiliar foreign vices. Yet the numbers grew. Families reported missing sons, fathers who could no longer work, wives whose husbands had changed. Productivity in some districts declined noticeably, and unrest began to stir quietly. Merchants, sensing the growing market, were relentless. They established networks that spanned ports and rivers, employing clever tactics to avoid detection. Ships loaded with opium slipped past inspections, and local smugglers ensured that no district went without supply. Even in regions far from the coasts, the golden leaves began to circulate, carried inland by traders who understood that the empire's wealth could be easily manipulated. The problem, once minor, now threatened to infiltrate the very heart of the Qing dynasty. The social consequences were immediate. Children were neglected as parents became increasingly dependent. Neighborhoods that once thrived on communal labor and shared festivals began to show cracks. Gossip in small villages shifted from the usual news to tales of hidden dens, secret rituals, and lives slowly unraveling. Scholars recorded with unease the growing prevalence of addiction, noting its capacity to undermine morality, discipline, and familial loyalty. Even those in the upper echelons of society were not immune. Officials who once administered justice with precision now delayed decisions, their minds clouded by dependence. The emperor, distant yet perceptive, began to take notice. He received reports describing the creeping spread of opium, the collapse of local economies, and the subtle decay of social order. At court, advisors debated how to confront the issue, but the problem was unlike any they had faced before. Military might could enforce rules temporarily, but it could not reach into the private lives of citizens or resist the insidious attraction of pleasure disguised as relief. Some argued for total prohibition, while others warned that suppression could provoke conflict with the foreign traders who controlled the flow of opium. By the late 18th century, opium had moved from a curiosity to a serious societal problem. Its reach extended from the crowded streets of Guangzhou to the distant river towns, touching all classes, from the impoverished to the wealthy. The empire, once confident in its ability to maintain order and discipline, now confronted a challenge it had never faced, a threat that did not rely on armies or weapons, but on desire, curiosity, and addiction. In quiet moments along the riverbanks, one could see the visible toll. Laborers who once carried rice and timber from dawn to dusk now stumbled along the docks, their hands trembling, their eyes dull. Families gathered silently, fearful to speak of the addiction that had quietly claimed a father or brother. The golden leaves, small and seemingly harmless, were altering the rhythm of daily life in a civilization that had thrived for centuries. And yet, even as the problem grew, the empire's culture remained resilient in appearance. Markets thrived, festivals continued, and the scholars wrote their poetry. But beneath this veneer, the first fractures appeared. Corruption took root in the administration, as some officials accepted bribes to ignore smuggling, while others fell prey to opium themselves. Social cohesion weakened imperceptibly, a slow erosion that no decree could immediately repair. The stage was set for a series of confrontations that would shake the empire to its core. Foreign traders, sensing opportunity, expanded their networks, while the Qing officials attempted increasingly desperate measures to curb the tide. The tension between profit, addiction, and sovereignty escalated, moving China closer to a series of events that would ultimately challenge the might and authority of one of the world's greatest empires. As night falls over the rivers and cities, the golden leaves continue their silent spread. The story of opium in China is not merely a story of trade or addiction. It is the story of how subtle, unseen forces can slowly unravel even the most powerful societies. Each puff, each hidden transaction, each quiet moment of indulgence carried within it the seeds of change. A quiet revolution that would shake dynasties and alter history forever. The empire, vast and proud, was on the cusp of a transformation that would be felt for generations. And as we continue this journey tonight, the tale of opium's grip on China unfolds not in grand battles alone, but in the quiet, unseen struggles of ordinary people and the subtle, relentless pressure on an empire that once seemed unbreakable. By the early decades of the 19th century, the Qing government could no longer ignore the growing crisis. What had begun as isolated cases of indulgence had become a widespread social and economic problem. Provincial officials sent reports to the imperial court describing entire communities disrupted by addiction. Markets that once thrived on honest trade were now infiltrated by smugglers, and public order was under threat. The emperor's advisors debated endlessly in the marble halls of the Forbidden City, weighing the risks of decisive action against the potential for international conflict. The first measures were cautious. Local magistrates were instructed to monitor the flow of opium and report suspicious activity. Punishments were sometimes imposed, usually fines or brief detentions, but these measures proved ineffective against a trade that was both lucrative and cunningly concealed. Foreign merchants adapted quickly, employing new routes, secret compartments in ships, and bribing officials when necessary. The empire's vast bureaucracy, efficient in administering taxes and justice in peacetime, struggled to enforce laws against a subtle, pervasive, and highly profitable illicit market. Gradually, more stringent measures were introduced. Edicts forbade the sale, consumption, and transport of opium. Officials were tasked with inspecting warehouses, seizing contraband, and punishing offenders. For a time, these crackdowns created temporary reductions in supply, but the consequences were often uneven. Smuggling continued, sometimes under the very noses of the inspectors. In port cities such as Canton, the smell of burning opium in confiscated dens became common, a grim signal that the empire's struggle was intensifying. The economic dimension of the problem added another layer of complexity. The Chinese economy relied heavily on trade with foreign powers, particularly Britain. British merchants had discovered that opium grown in India under colonial administration could be exchanged for silver, tea, and silk at enormous profit. Attempts by the Qing to limit opium imports directly threatened the profits of powerful trading companies, and tensions began to rise. Smuggling networks extended from the southern ports into the heart of the empire, creating a shadow economy that rivaled the official one in size and influence. Officials faced a delicate balancing act, suppressing opium to forcefully risk alienating foreign powers and provoking retaliation, but failure to act threatened the empire itself. In the 1830s, the appointment of a determined and energetic official, Lin Zexu, to the port of Canton marked a turning point. Lin, deeply committed to the moral and social principles of the Qing dynasty, understood that opium was more than a vice, it was a threat to the empire's very foundation. He began a campaign that combined moral exhortation, strict enforcement, and public example. Lin's efforts were methodical. He conducted inspections of warehouses, confiscated opium from traders, and destroyed stockpiles in large public burnings designed to send a clear message. Letters were sent to foreign merchants demanding the surrender of opium and warning of severe consequences. Lin's resolve reflected not only a commitment to law and order, but a broader vision of preserving the integrity and sovereignty of the empire. He recognized that allowing opium to spread unchecked would weaken not just the economy, but the authority of the emperor himself. The foreign merchants, however, were unyielding. For them, opium was not a mere commodity, it was the linchpin of immense profits. Resistance to Lin's policies escalated tensions, and soon the situation moved beyond moral persuasion and bureaucratic enforcement. Diplomatic exchanges became strained, as British traders insisted on the right to conduct trade freely, while the Qing authorities demanded compliance with imperial law. The seeds of conflict were sown in these confrontations, where trade, sovereignty, and ethics collided in increasingly irreconcilable ways. The social effects within China continued to worsen. In the south, where the opium trade was concentrated, communities experienced increasing dislocation. Families fractured as dependencies spread. Labor productivity declined, and the fabric of daily life grew frayed. Officials reported cases of theft, debt, and even violence related to addiction. The emperor's court, distant yet aware, grappled with how to enforce moral and social order over such a vast empire. For all the grandeur of palaces and bureaucratic machinery, the challenge posed by opium seemed invisible, pervasive, and relentless. Lin's campaign, though decisive, highlighted a deeper problem. The empire faced forces that could not be contained by law alone. Foreign powers, motivated by profit and supported by naval strength, were prepared to resist Chinese authority. Smugglers adapted, and local corruption complicated enforcement. Even as opium stockpiles were burned and arrests made, new shipments arrived, perpetuating the cycle. The empire was trapped in a struggle where morality, law, and economic necessity were in constant tension, and where failure could have far-reaching consequences. By the mid-1830s, the tension reached a critical point. Lin Zexu issued a final demand to the foreign merchants to surrender their opium, a demand backed by the threat of severe punishment. The merchants, backed by British interests, refused. What followed was a series of confrontations that escalated beyond trade disputes into military action. Chinese officials, frustrated and desperate, began to fortify ports and organize defenses. Yet the technology and naval power of foreign forces posed a significant challenge. The empire's traditional strength, rooted in land-based armies and civil administration, was ill-prepared for the modern, maritime confrontation that was unfolding. As the first shots were fired in the ports along the southern coast, it became clear that China's struggle against opium was no longer confined to morality. Law or social stability had become a struggle for survival, sovereignty, and identity. The Opium Wars, which historians would later describe as both tragic and transformative, were beginning. Battles would rage over ports, rivers, and trade routes. Treaties would be imposed, humiliations endured, and territorial concessions made. The consequences of opium were no longer hidden in the quiet dens or hidden shipments. They were now visible on a national scale, altering the course of the empire forever. In the villages and towns far from the coast, ordinary people watched with fear and uncertainty. Families who had already suffered the effects of addiction now faced the added turmoil of war and disruption. Scholars debated the morality of foreign trade and the failure of the government to maintain order. Merchants faced impossible choices between compliance and profit. The empire's stability, once taken for granted, now hung in a delicate balance, threatened by forces both within and beyond its borders. The story of opium in China is not merely one of commerce or addiction. It is a story of human ambition and vulnerability, of cultural pride confronted by economic pressure, and of a civilization forced to confront unprecedented challenges. The early crackdowns, the rise of determined officials like Lin Zexu, and the escalating conflicts with foreign traders marked the transition from quiet social erosion to open crisis. And as we move forward, the Opium Wars themselves will reveal the profound consequences of these choices, demonstrating how a seemingly small substance could alter the fate of an entire empire. Even as battles loomed, there was a strange calm along the rivers and streets. Merchants prepared for conflict, officials implemented strategies, and ordinary people tried to continue daily life. The empire, vast and proud, seemed both resilient and fragile, its fate intertwined with forces that it had only begun to understand. The golden leaves of opium, which had entered quietly, now demanded attention and action on a scale that no one had anticipated. And so, the stage was set for confrontation. The Qing dynasty faced foreign powers whose weapons, ships, and strategies were unlike anything encountered before. The empire's moral authority and social cohesion were tested against economic greed and technological superiority. In this tension, the first true battles of the Opium Wars would emerge, and the world would witness the beginning of a transformation in China, one that would ripple across society, politics, and history for decades to come. As the sun rose over the southern coast, the quiet river towns that had long carried the rhythm of daily life now braced for the sound of cannons. Smoke drifted across the water, mingling with the scent of salt and the subtle fragrance of tea leaves that had been traded here for generations. People moved cautiously through the streets, carrying on with their routines as best they could, while a sense of unease hung in the air. The golden leaves that had once whispered promises of escape had now become a symbol of conflict and fear, their trade a spark for a war that would change the empire forever. In the port city of Canton, officials prepared defenses with meticulous care. Forts along the riverbanks were reinforced, and militia trained to respond to any naval assault. Soldiers adjusted their uniforms and polished their weapons, aware that their skills, honed for land-based skirmishes and internal security, might not match the precision and firepower of foreign ships. Yet even in the face of uncertainty, a sense of duty persisted. These men understood that the preservation of their homeland, their emperor, and their communities depended on their vigilance and courage. On the other side, British naval forces moved with calculated efficiency. Their ships, equipped with cannons capable of firing over great distances, glided through the harbor waters with an almost unnatural precision. Commanders coordinated attacks from the deck, their strategies honed by years of experience in faraway colonies. The contrast was stark, one side defending an empire steeped in tradition, the other advancing with modern naval tactics and weaponry. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not only military might, but the resilience and adaptability of human societies. The first skirmishes were tense and chaotic. Cannon fire echoed across the river, splintering timber and sending waves crashing against the docks. Civilians ducked behind walls and carts, peering cautiously at the unfolding battle. Merchants tried to salvage goods, while families huddled in quiet homes, their hearts pounding as smoke and shouts mingled in the air. The sound of distant explosions became a grim rhythm, each reverberation a reminder of the fragile line between life and destruction. Amidst the chaos, local leaders attempted to maintain order. They guided people to safer areas, coordinated with militia, and relayed messages between forts and villages. Their efforts, though valiant, were often challenged by the speed and precision of the foreign forces. The empire's traditional methods of defense, rooted in centuries of land-based warfare, were tested against a new kind of military strategy, one that relied on mobility, long-range firepower, and the element of surprise. As battles raged along the coast, the human cost became painfully evident. Families were displaced, homes destroyed, and livelihoods disrupted. Laborers who once carried rice and silk to distant ports found themselves navigating streets littered with debris and fear. Children, too young to understand the politics or strategies behind the conflict, clung to parents whose eyes reflected both determination and despair. And yet, even in this turmoil, life persisted. Vendors offered food to soldiers and displaced citizens, monks tended to the injured, and communities rallied to support one another amidst uncertainty. The strategies of both sides evolved rapidly. Qing forces attempted to fortify key ports and prevent the landing of troops. Artillery was positioned strategically along cliffs and riverbanks, while naval vessels patrolled the waters, trying to intercept the enemy before they could reach the shores. British commanders adapted to the environment, using faster ships to outmaneuver slower vessels, targeting supply lines, and coordinating simultaneous assaults along multiple points of the coast. The ebb and flow of conflict resembled the tides themselves, sometimes advancing, sometimes retreating, but always relentless, pushing both sides to their limits. Amid the smoke and noise, stories of individual bravery emerged. Soldiers defended small forts against overwhelming odds, their determination fueled by loyalty to family and emperor. Civilians, though unarmed, performed acts of courage by guiding refugees to safety, hiding valuable documents and treasures, or simply offering comfort to those injured in the chaos. These small acts, often overlooked in grand historical accounts, revealed the human dimension of the conflict, the resilience, fear, and compassion that persisted even when the empire itself was under siege. The economic implications of the battles were immediate and severe. Trade routes were disrupted, ports were blocked, and markets destabilized. Merchants, once thriving on the bustling exchange of goods, now faced losses that could ruin entire families. Silver, tea, silk, and other commodities stagnated in warehouses, unable to reach their destinations. The opium trade, the very spark of the conflict, became both a prize and a liability. While foreign traders attempted to protect their cargo, Chinese authorities worked to intercept shipments. creating a tense cat-and-mouse game that stretched across rivers and coastal waters. The psychological impact on the empire was profound. News of defeats and victories traveled slowly, carried by messengers and official dispatches. Communities reacted with a mix of fear, pride, and disbelief. Parents worried about the safety of sons conscripted into defense, while scholars debated the ethical implications of foreign aggression and domestic policies. The narrative of opium, once confined to tea-houses and private indulgence, had now become inseparable from the larger story of sovereignty, national pride, and cultural survival. Even as the southern coast became a theater of war, the interior regions of the empire observed cautiously. Provincial governors and local officials monitored developments closely, preparing contingency plans and reinforcing local militias. Some communities attempted to continue normal life, maintaining agriculture and local trade, while others faced shortages of supplies and growing anxiety over the spread of conflict. The reach of opium, now entwined with foreign military power, had transformed from a subtle social issue into a full-scale national crisis. As the days and weeks passed, the initial skirmishes escalated into sustained engagements. Ports changed hands, ships were damaged or sunk, and fortifications were tested repeatedly. The Qing forces learned quickly, adapting tactics to respond to the speed and firepower of foreign fleets. Yet, despite these adjustments, the empire faced significant disadvantages in technology and logistics. The contrast between traditional methods and modern warfare became increasingly apparent, revealing the vulnerabilities of an empire that had long relied on stability and bureaucracy, rather than rapid adaptation to foreign military innovation. In the midst of these events, the human toll continued to grow. Refugees fled from coastal towns, carrying what possessions they could. Farmers abandoned fields to avoid conflict, leading to food shortages and economic strain. Families separated by chaos struggled to reunite, while local leaders worked tirelessly to provide shelter and aid. Even as the empire's military strategies unfolded, the quiet suffering of ordinary people reminded all involved that the consequences of war extended far beyond the battlefield. This phase of the conflict, though focused on tactical engagements along rivers and coasts, revealed broader themes. It highlighted the fragility of even the mightiest empires when faced with new technologies and strategies. It demonstrated the interconnectedness of trade, politics, and human behavior, showing how the introduction of a single commodity opium could cascade into social disruption, economic instability, and military confrontation. And it illuminated the courage and resilience of those living through it, from soldiers defending forts to civilians navigating streets shadowed by cannon fire. The first battles of the Opium Wars were not decisive in themselves, but they set the tone for the conflicts to come. They revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the Qing dynasty, the relentless determination of foreign traders and military forces, and the human costs that accompanied geopolitical struggles. As the smoke settled each night, the empire faced the sobering realization that these battles were merely the beginning. The larger conflict, involving diplomacy, trade negotiations, and further military engagements, was just unfolding, and the shadow of opium continued to stretch across every corner of society. By the end of this chapter along the southern coast, the consequences of opium and foreign military intervention were evident. Communities had been disrupted, trade patterns altered, and social cohesion strained. The Qing dynasty, proud and long established, now faced a challenge that went beyond conventional military strategy or governance. The empire was entering a phase where adaptation, resilience, and understanding of foreign power dynamics would determine not just the outcome of battles, but the very survival of the state as it had been known for centuries. And so, as night falls once again over the rivers and coastal towns, the story of the Opium Wars continues quietly, relentlessly, and with a human dimension that reminds us of the cost of trade, desire, and conflict. The golden leaves that arrived decades earlier have transformed from a curiosity into a symbol of disruption, a spark that ignited battles, altered lives, and reshaped the trajectory of one of the world's greatest empires. The southern coast, once a hub of commerce and culture, had become a landscape of tension and uncertainty. Smoke from cannon fire still lingered over the harbor waters, and towns that had thrived on trade were scarred by repeated clashes. The Qing officials, having witnessed the initial battles, understood that this was no ordinary conflict. Foreign ships, with their speed, firepower, and organization, could strike at multiple points simultaneously, rendering traditional defensive strategies only partially effective. The empire faced a challenge unlike any it had seen in centuries, a combination of military, economic, and social pressure that demanded swift adaptation. The emperor's court deliberated intensely. Dispatches from the southern provinces described the difficulties faced by local commanders, the resilience of foreign forces, and the growing unrest among citizens. Advisors debated the merits of continued resistance versus negotiation. Some urged a firm stance, emphasizing the importance of sovereignty and the preservation of the empire's authority. Others, aware of the technological and logistical advantages held by foreign powers, cautioned that compromise might prevent further devastation. These discussions reflected a central tension. How could the empire protect its people and its prestige while confronting forces that operated under unfamiliar rules and motivations? Meanwhile, along the rivers and in port cities, the human impact of the conflict intensified. Refugees moved inland, carrying stories of destroyed homes, lost livelihoods, and the relentless spread of opium. Merchants, caught between the demands of foreign traders and imperial authorities, struggled to maintain business and protect their families. Soldiers endured long days of vigilance and combat, often far from their homes, while local communities organized to provide food, shelter, and care for the injured. The daily rhythms of life were disrupted, yet life continued, revealing the persistence and adaptability of ordinary people in times of crisis. Foreign commanders, confident in their naval superiority, pressed their advantage. They implemented blockades to restrict the movement of Qing forces and sought to control key ports essential for trade and supply. Skirmishes along the rivers tested both sides' strategies and resolve. The Qing forces, while valiant and disciplined, found themselves challenged by unfamiliar weapons and tactics. Traditional fortifications were often circumvented, and naval engagements highlighted the gap between centuries-old military practices and modern maritime technology. These confrontations, though relatively small in scale individually, collectively demonstrated the empire's vulnerability to sustained foreign pressure. Diplomatic efforts unfolded alongside the battles. The Qing court sent envoys to negotiate with British officials, aiming to reach agreements that could preserve some measure of autonomy and limit further destruction. Foreign diplomats, motivated by trade interests and national pride, approached negotiations with their own objectives, seeking concessions and guarantees that favored their economic and strategic goals. The interplay between military action and diplomacy created a tense environment where every decision had far-reaching consequences, and where missteps could result in both human suffering and political humiliation. As engagements continued, the Qing Empire experienced its first major defeats. Strategic ports fell to foreign forces, and attempts to retake or defend them often resulted in heavy losses. News of these setbacks spread quickly through the bureaucracy, prompting both alarm and introspection. Officials analyzed the causes of defeat, noting the technological disparity, challenges in coordination, and the persistent issue of opium-induced weakness among some personnel. For the emperor and his advisors, these defeats were not merely tactical, they represented a symbolic erosion of authority and a threat to the perceived invincibility of the dynasty. At the same time, the opium trade continued to complicate matters. Foreign merchants, often under the protection of naval forces, maintained their supply lines, ensuring that economic incentives remained strong despite conflict. Local smuggling networks adapted to shifting front lines, moving goods inland or through alternative ports. The very commodity that had sparked the crisis remained central to both the foreign agenda and the internal struggle, illustrating how intertwined economic interests and military power had become. Communities along the coast bore the brunt of these developments. Markets were disrupted, homes damaged, and social cohesion strained. Families displaced by conflict faced shortages of food and resources, while local leaders worked to maintain order and provide support. The psychological toll was significant, as people witnessed both the violence of battle and the wider implications of foreign dominance. At the same time, stories of resilience and ingenuity emerged. Citizens devised ways to protect property, care for the wounded, and sustain communities under extreme pressure. These acts of quiet courage, though often invisible in historical records, reveal the human dimension of an empire under siege. The escalation of hostilities eventually led to formal treaty negotiations. The British, leveraging military victories and strategic positions, pressed for agreements that secured trade rights, territorial concessions, and legal protections for their nationals. Qing representatives, aware of the disparity in power, faced the difficult task of protecting imperial dignity while minimizing further destruction. These negotiations, conducted under intense pressure, highlighted the intersection of power, diplomacy, and the human cost of conflict. Each clause, each concession, carried consequences for both governance and society, shaping the empire's trajectory for decades. One of the most profound consequences of these early defeats and negotiations was the erosion of traditional authority. Local officials, who once exercised significant autonomy in managing trade and law enforcement, now found themselves constrained by foreign influence and central directives from a court, navigating unprecedented circumstances. The imperial image of invincibility, long reinforced by centuries of internal stability and successful governance, was tarnished. Citizens observed both the might of foreign forces and the limitations of their own government, leading to a subtle, yet significant shift in perception. Amid these transformations, the human experience remained central. Soldiers reflected on their role in defending an empire challenged by unfamiliar forces. Families grieved for lost members or faced the uncertainty of displacement. Merchants weighed profit against safety, and communities adapted to the disruptions imposed by both conflict and opium addiction. These experiences illustrate that the story of the Opium Wars is not only one of battles and treaties, but also of the daily lives of ordinary people navigating extraordinary circumstances. The first treaties imposed by foreign powers marked a turning point. Ports were opened to trade under terms dictated by British officials, legal privileges were extended to foreign nationals, and mechanisms were established to protect commercial interests. For the Qing dynasty, these concessions represented both a loss of sovereignty and a necessity to prevent further devastation. Socially and economically, the effects were profound. Trade patterns shifted, wealth flowed differently, and the balance of power within coastal regions transformed. Communities had to adjust to a new reality in which foreign presence was both inevitable and dominant. The consequences of these developments extended far beyond the immediate military and diplomatic outcomes. The integration of foreign powers into trade and governance frameworks challenged long-standing cultural norms and social structures. Ordinary citizens witnessed shifts in authority, law, and economic opportunity, while officials faced the challenge of maintaining order in a rapidly changing environment. The opium crisis, once a local concern, had now evolved into a multifaceted national and international problem, reshaping not only trade and politics but the very fabric of society. Despite these early defeats, the Qing dynasty demonstrated resilience in both governance and adaptation. Officials sought ways to strengthen local defenses, improve coordination among forces, and mitigate the social impacts of war and addiction. Communities found innovative solutions to sustain livelihoods and maintain cohesion, while scholars and moralists reflected on the lessons of conflict, trade, and human vulnerability. These efforts, though often insufficient to reverse immediate losses, illustrate the ongoing struggle of an empire confronting forces far beyond its previous experience. As the dust settled on the first major treaties and military campaigns, it became clear that China's path forward would be neither simple nor swift. The combination of foreign pressure, opium addiction, and social disruption had altered the empire's trajectory. Decisions made during these years would reverberate for generations, shaping both the internal development of society and the empire's position in a rapidly globalizing world. The human stories of courage, adaptation, and endurance remained entwined with the broader historical forces at play, reminding all who lived through these times that history is shaped as much by individuals as by armies and empires. By the end of this period, the Qing dynasty faced a sobering reality. The southern coast, once a symbol of prosperity and stability, had become a theater of conflict and negotiation, a microcosm of the challenges facing the empire as a whole. The consequences of opium, foreign trade, and military defeat were interwoven, demonstrating how economic, social, and political forces could converge to reshape an empire's destiny. The stage was set for further escalation, deeper treaties, and more profound social consequences as the Opium Wars continued to unfold across China. The treaties signed along the southern coast brought a fragile and uneasy calm, yet their impact rippled far beyond the ports. Cities and towns that had once been insulated from foreign influence now faced the reality of traders, officials, and military forces exercising privileges that had previously been unimaginable. The very presence of foreign powers in Chinese ports was both a symbol and a practical demonstration of the empire's vulnerability. Citizens, once confident in the authority of local officials, now found that their lives were subtly, and sometimes dramatically, influenced by distant decisions made in foreign capitals and colonial administrations. In port cities, the daily rhythm of life changed. Merchants adapted to new regulations, balancing the demands of foreign traders with the shifting expectations of imperial authorities. Markets became more complex, as imported goods arrived under conditions dictated by foreign powers, often at prices that disadvantaged local producers. The legal protections afforded to foreign nationals created tensions, as disputes involving property, trade, and local customs were increasingly adjudicated with foreign interests in mind. Communities learned to navigate this new landscape cautiously, aware that missteps could have both economic and social consequences. Opium, the substance that had sparked the wars, continued to spread inland. While initial attention had focused on coastal regions, traders and smugglers moved deeper into the empire, reaching towns and villages previously untouched by addiction. The social effects became increasingly pronounced. Families were disrupted, laborers became unreliable, and local economies struggled under the dual pressures of addiction and the presence of foreign-controlled trade. The subtle erosion of social cohesion, which had begun decades earlier, now intensified, affecting communities in ways that were both visible and invisible. Within the imperial court, debates raged over the proper response to these intertwined crises. Some officials argued for strict enforcement of anti-opium policies, advocating for harsher punishments, public campaigns, and more aggressive policing of trade routes. Others cautioned that excessive measures could provoke further foreign retaliation or destabilize regions already suffering from social disruption. These discussions highlighted a central tension: the need to uphold the moral authority of the emperor and the empire, while also contending with the practical limitations imposed by international power dynamics and the pervasive influence of opium. Moral and philosophical considerations were central to these debates. Scholars and advisors reflected on the nature of addiction, the responsibility of the state to protect its citizens, and the broader implications of foreign interference. The idea that opium was not merely a substance, but a social and political force, became increasingly accepted. The empire's leaders recognized that the spread of addiction undermined not only productivity and family structure, but also the legitimacy of governance itself. The challenge was no longer just a matter of law enforcement. It had become a test of the empire's moral, social, and political resilience. In towns and villages, the human consequences of these debates were tangible. Families struggled to cope with addiction among fathers, sons, and brothers. Women, often left to manage households alone, navigated scarce resources and social stigma. Children witnessed the decline of parental authority and the disruption of daily life. Communities attempted to provide informal support, with neighbors assisting one another, and local leaders organizing relief efforts. The spread of opium was a slow, insidious force, undermining the fabric of society, while also creating opportunities for resilience, adaptation, and human compassion. The presence of foreign traders and officials introduced new cultural dynamics. Chinese citizens encountered different languages, customs, and legal systems, which challenged long-established social hierarchies and norms. In port cities, interactions between locals and foreigners became a complex negotiation, as merchants and residents balanced economic opportunity against social and moral concerns. These encounters, while often pragmatic, subtly influenced ideas about governance, commerce, and social order, shaping the perspectives of those living at the intersection of traditional Chinese society and an emerging global network. Economic disruption remained a pressing concern. Traditional industries, from agriculture to artisanal production, faced competition from foreign imports and internal instability caused by addiction. Local markets fluctuated unpredictably, as both demand and supply were affected by social upheaval. Labor shortages in key areas led to delays in construction, trade, and agriculture. While some regions experienced localized scarcity of essential goods, the empire's officials, while attempting to stabilize the economy, were confronted with the limitations of existing administrative structures in managing such complex and multifaceted challenges. Education and scholarly life also felt the effects of these crises. Schools and academies, particularly in regions affected by opium or foreign intrusion, faced declining attendance and resources. Scholars debated the moral and practical implications of foreign influence, the spread of addiction, and the necessity of reform. Texts and treatises written during this period reflect a growing awareness that the empire's survival depended not only on military strength, but also on intellectual, social, and cultural adaptability. These reflections illustrate how deeply the crises permeated all aspects of society, shaping thought, policy, and daily life. Religious and philosophical institutions responded in parallel. Temples and monasteries offered refuge and support for those struggling with addiction, while religious leaders sought to interpret the crises within broader moral and spiritual frameworks. Their guidance provided solace to some while also influencing social attitudes toward addiction, foreign presence, and the responsibilities of the state. The interplay between religious, moral, and political considerations created a complex social landscape, in which each community navigated multiple layers of authority, expectation, and survival. As opium continued its inland spread, the empire faced the dual challenge of addressing immediate social crises and preparing for potential future conflicts. Military leaders observed the vulnerability of coastal regions and anticipated further foreign incursions. Local officials balanced enforcement with diplomacy, trying to maintain order without provoking additional violence. The interplay between domestic stability, international pressure, and the pervasive social influence of opium became increasingly evident, underscoring the difficulty of maintaining an empire that was both vast and deeply interconnected. The first treaties, while intended to stabilize relations, had paradoxical effects. They opened channels for trade and communication, but also legitimized foreign influence in ways that constrained the empire's autonomy. The juxtaposition of legal foreign privileges with widespread social disruption created tensions at every level of society. Citizens, merchants, and officials alike navigated these new realities with caution, ingenuity, and, at times, frustration. The lessons learned during this period would influence subsequent policy decisions, shaping the Qing dynasty's approach to governance, diplomacy, and social control for decades to come. At the human level, the psychological impact was profound. Communities learned to live with the constant presence of foreign powers and the persistent threat of addiction. Families adapted to changing economic conditions, social hierarchies shifted subtly, and ordinary people developed coping strategies to survive the disruptions. These experiences reveal the intimate connection between grand historical forces: war, trade, addiction, and the daily lives of individuals, highlighting the resilience, ingenuity, and vulnerability of human societies. By the end of this period, the Qing dynasty faced a sobering realization. The empire's social fabric had been stretched thin by opium, foreign influence, and the consequences of treaty concessions. The moral authority of the state was under scrutiny. Communities were challenged by economic and social disruption, and ordinary citizens lived with uncertainty and fear. Yet, amid these challenges, there was evidence of resilience. Local leaders organized relief, scholars debated reform, and families adapted to new realities. The empire was far from broken, but it was clear that navigating the next decades would require not only strength and discipline, but also understanding, adaptation, and foresight. The story of opium and foreign intrusion intertwined with the broader struggles of society, governance, and human resilience was unfolding across China. The lessons of these years about trade, morality, power, and adaptation would resonate through the empire's history, influencing both policy and the daily lives of ordinary people. As the empire moved forward, it would have to confront not only external pressures, but also the internal transformations that opium and foreign influence had set in motion, reshaping the landscape of Chinese society in profound and lasting ways. Following the first treaties, the Qing dynasty recognized that superficial measures were no longer sufficient. The empire's leadership understood that opium and foreign influence were reshaping the very foundations of society. Provincial governors were instructed to implement reforms aimed at strengthening administration, curbing smuggling, and maintaining public order. These reforms were designed to address both immediate threats and longer-term vulnerabilities, reflecting a growing awareness that survival required adaptation, coordination, and moral as well as practical strategies. One of the primary focuses of these reforms was the enforcement of anti-opium policies. Officials were directed to monitor trade routes more closely, inspect warehouses, and confiscate contraband whenever it was found. Penalties were increased, and public campaigns emphasized the dangers of addiction to both individuals and the empire. In some regions, officials organized educational sessions, hoping to persuade communities to resist opium voluntarily. These efforts reflected a dual approach, combining moral exhortation with legal enforcement, in the hope that both would reinforce each other and gradually restore social order. In parallel, the Qing military sought to strengthen inland defenses. While the first conflicts had been concentrated along the southern coast, the empire recognized that future foreign incursions could extend further inland. Rivers, bridges, and mountain passes became points of strategic concern. Garrison towns were reinforced, local militias trained more rigorously, and coordination between provincial armies was improved. These preparations were often challenging, as inland regions lacked the same exposure to modern military technology and tactics that coastal defenses had begun to encounter. Yet, the empire understood that the survival of society depended on readiness, even in areas far removed from the initial theaters of conflict. As reforms took hold, the social impact of opium spread to central provinces. Merchants and smugglers adapted quickly, moving shipments along less monitored routes. Towns that had previously been unaffected began to experience the effects of addiction, decreased productivity, family disruption, and rising social tension. The moral and economic consequences became intertwined, as communities struggled to sustain themselves while contending with the erosion of labor and authority caused by dependency. Officials dispatched to these regions faced not only enforcement challenges, but also the task of restoring public confidence in governance, which had been shaken by the initial wave of conflict along the coast. The response of ordinary citizens varied. Some communities resisted, organizing local watch groups and reporting illicit trade. Others, weary of hardship and drawn by curiosity or necessity, became complicit, participating in the trade or succumbing to addiction themselves. Families faced difficult choices: how to protect children, maintain livelihoods, and navigate the shifting landscape of law, trade, and social expectation. The complexity of these decisions highlights the intricate relationship between policy, social norms, and human behavior in times of crisis. In the imperial court, debates continued over the effectiveness of these reforms. Some advisors argued that stricter enforcement alone would suffice, emphasizing the importance of upholding moral authority and demonstrating imperial resolve. Others cautioned that measures must be balanced with diplomatic sensitivity, particularly given the ongoing presence of foreign powers with both economic and military leverage. These discussions reflected the tension between principle and pragmatism, a theme that would recur throughout the empire's efforts to manage opium, trade, and foreign influence. Economic considerations remained central to decision-making. Inland regions experienced fluctuations in trade, as traditional goods were disrupted by the movement of foreign commodities and the effects of addiction on labor. Markets were strained, with some towns facing scarcity, while others struggled with surplus. Officials sought to stabilize these areas, but the intertwined nature of commerce, opium, and social behavior made solutions complex. At the same time, foreign traders continued to exert influence, maintaining networks that reached deep into the interior, often beyond the immediate reach of imperial enforcement. Education and scholarship reflected the empire's evolving understanding of these crises. Scholars wrote treatises on the social, economic, and moral dimensions of opium use, exploring both causes and potential remedies. Academies discussed reforms in governance, military strategy, and economic management, emphasizing the need for both moral leadership and practical solutions. Religious and philosophical institutions, too, played a role, offering guidance to communities, providing support for affected families, and framing the crises within larger ethical and spiritual contexts. These intellectual responses demonstrate the empire's efforts to grapple with unprecedented challenges through reflection, debate, and moral reasoning. As opium spread further inland, the human consequences deepened. Families faced addiction not as a distant threat, but as an immediate, daily reality. Laborers who once provided the backbone of agriculture and trade became unreliable, and the disruption of production had cascading effects on local economies. Communities adapted as best they could. Informal support networks emerged. Local leaders organized relief efforts, and neighbors assisted one another in navigating both economic and social pressures. The persistent spread of opium revealed that the empire's challenges were no longer confined to coastal regions. They had become national in scope. The military reforms and inland preparations reflected a broader understanding of vulnerability. Leaders recognized that future conflicts would not be limited to direct battles, but could manifest in the form of social unrest. economic disruption, and widespread addiction. The empire's strategy evolved accordingly. Defensive measures were combined with enforcement, moral campaigns, and efforts to strengthen community resilience. These multifaceted approaches demonstrate a recognition that survival depended not only on military might, but on the capacity to maintain social cohesion, economic stability, and cultural integrity. During this period, foreign influence intensified in subtle ways. Merchants and advisors provided technical knowledge, introduced new commodities, and created networks that extended the reach of foreign power beyond simple trade. These interactions had complex consequences. They brought both opportunity and risk, exposure and vulnerability. Communities learned to navigate these dynamics, balancing pragmatism with caution. The presence of foreign agents, combined with the spread of opium, created a landscape in which every social, economic, and political decision carried amplified significance. By the late 1830s, the Qing dynasty faced a sobering reality. The empire's strength and stability depended on the ability to integrate military, administrative, and social reforms, while simultaneously addressing the moral and human dimensions of opium addiction. Provincial officials, scholars, religious leaders, and ordinary citizens all played a role in this effort, negotiating daily life in a society undergoing profound transformation. The empire had demonstrated resilience, yet it was clear that the challenges ahead required sustained attention, coordination, and foresight. In the midst of these reforms and preparations, the human stories continued to unfold. Families adjusted to shifting social norms, laborers adapted to changing economic conditions, and communities found ways to survive and support one another. The spread of opium, while destructive, also revealed the resilience of individuals and the capacity of society to respond creatively to crisis. These narratives, often invisible in the records of treaties and battles, provide a vital window into the lived experience of a nation navigating one of its most profound historical challenges. The spread of opium into the central provinces underscored a critical lesson. The empire's vulnerabilities were interconnected. Social disruption, economic instability, and foreign influence were not isolated phenomena, but part of a larger, systemic challenge. Each town, each family, each decision contributed to a complex web of consequences that shaped the empire's trajectory. The responses, implemented administrative reforms, military preparations, moral campaigns represented a comprehensive attempt to address this multifaceted crisis, reflecting both the strengths and limitations of Qing governance. By the end of this period, the empire had adapted in numerous ways, yet the challenges remained formidable. The inland spread of opium, combined with the lingering effects of foreign treaties and social disruption, created an environment in which every choice carried weighty consequences. The Qing dynasty, with its long history of stability and resilience, now confronted the reality that survival in this era required both traditional wisdom and innovative responses. The stage was set for further conflicts, deeper social transformation, and continued negotiation between internal stability and external pressure. As the opium crisis deepened and foreign influence spread inland, communities across China began to experience strains that were as psychological and social as they were economic. Families faced the slow erosion of authority, as fathers and sons succumbed to addiction, laborers became unreliable, and households struggled to maintain routines. In towns and villages, whispers of discontent grew louder, carried along market streets, riverbanks, and tea houses. Ordinary citizens, aware of both the moral decay and the growing presence of foreign powers, began to question the effectiveness of the imperial government. Local militias, long responsible for defending towns and villages, faced unprecedented challenges. Their traditional roles protecting communities, maintaining law and order, and supporting provincial forces were now complicated by the dual threats of foreign intrusion and social instability caused by addiction. Militia leaders found themselves negotiating between compliance with imperial directives and responding to immediate local needs, often encountering resistance from townsfolk who were weary of strict enforcement or suspicious of distant officials. The delicate balance between authority and trust became increasingly fragile. Early resistance movements began to take shape, often rooted in local grievances. Some groups emerged in coastal towns that had experienced repeated foreign attacks, seeking to protect their communities from further intrusion. Others formed in inland provinces, where the spread of opium had disrupted traditional social and economic structures. These movements were diverse. Some acted independently, motivated by local solidarity and moral outrage, while others sought coordination with imperial authorities, hoping to restore order and defend social norms. In every case, the participants faced both physical danger and social scrutiny, navigating a world in which loyalty, survival, and morality were constantly in tension. The relationship between these militias and the imperial government was complex. On one hand, the Qing dynasty relied on local forces to maintain stability, extend control into distant regions, and provide early warning of smuggling or rebellion. On the other hand, tensions often arose over the methods employed by local groups, the allocation of resources, and the interpretation of imperial law. Some militias acted with a degree of autonomy that alarmed provincial officials, leading to conflicts over authority and the limits of enforcement. The interplay between centralized authority and local initiative highlighted the challenges of governance in a vast empire facing both internal and external pressures. Opium continued to act as a corrosive agent, weakening individuals and undermining social cohesion. Reports from provincial governors described families in which multiple members were addicted, local economies suffering from labor shortages, and communities struggling to maintain morale and discipline. The empire's officials implemented education campaigns and strict penalties, but these measures were often inconsistent, hampered by corruption, logistical challenges, or the sheer scale of the problem. The slow, insidious nature of addiction meant that its effects were felt in subtle ways, shaping behavior, relationships, and community dynamics over time. At the same time, foreign influence continued to expand, not only in port cities but along trade routes extending inland. Merchants, diplomats, and intermediaries created networks that connected urban centers to distant provinces, facilitating both commerce and smuggling. This presence introduced new cultural norms, legal practices, and economic expectations, subtly altering the social landscape. Communities found themselves negotiating with foreign interests on a daily basis, balancing practical survival with adherence to traditional values and loyalty to the emperor. The result was a complex tapestry of interdependence, tension, and adaptation. Resistance movements were often caught in this web, while motivated by a desire to protect their communities or uphold moral norms. They had to contend with both local challenges and the broader strategic context of the empire. Some groups engaged in sabotage against smugglers, disrupted illegal trade, or organized community patrols. Others focused on moral persuasion, attempting to dissuade neighbors from using opium and maintain social cohesion. These efforts were uneven and localized, yet collectively they revealed the persistent efforts of ordinary citizens to assert agency amidst forces far larger than themselves. Imperial authorities monitored these movements closely. Reports from provincial officials emphasized the need to coordinate with local militias, provide guidance, and enforce consistent policies. At the same time, the court recognized that heavy-handed intervention could provoke resentment or escalate conflict. The tension between central directives and local autonomy created a delicate balancing act. The empire needed the energy and initiative of its citizens, while maintaining ultimate control over enforcement and strategy. This challenge illustrates a broader theme in China's struggle during the Opium Wars: the need to harmonize moral authority, administrative capacity, and social reality. Social unrest was compounded by economic instability. Agricultural production in affected areas declined as laborers fell victim to addiction or fled from conflict zones. Markets fluctuated unpredictably, with shortages of essential goods in some regions and surplus in others. Communities struggled to maintain trade, distribute resources, and support families. Local leaders sought creative solutions, such as organizing cooperative labor groups, reallocating resources, or negotiating with merchants and traders to stabilize essential supply chains. These efforts demonstrate how ordinary people and officials attempted to mitigate the cascading effects of addiction, conflict, and foreign intrusion. Education and moral guidance were also central to this period. Scholars and local leaders wrote pamphlets, held public lectures, and engaged with communities to reinforce ethical behavior and promote social cohesion. Temples and religious institutions played a parallel role, providing refuge, counseling, and support for those affected by opium or social disruption. These interventions were both practical and symbolic, reinforcing the idea that moral authority, community engagement, and personal responsibility were essential to resisting the destabilizing effects of foreign influence and addiction. Despite these efforts, the pressures of the time were relentless. The dual forces of foreign intervention and the inland spread of opium created conditions in which ordinary life was increasingly precarious. Families lived with uncertainty, militias navigated ambiguous authority, and communities adapted to rapidly changing circumstances. The tension between survival, loyalty, and morality shaped daily decisions, creating a lived experience that was simultaneously fragile and resilient. As the 1840s progressed, resistance movements became more organized in certain regions, often forming alliances across villages or coordinating with sympathetic provincial officials. These networks shared intelligence, pooled resources, and developed strategies to counter smuggling or maintain social order. While their success was varied, these efforts illustrate the dynamic interaction between local initiative and imperial oversight, highlighting the importance of community engagement in responding to widespread social and economic challenges. The Qing court, observing these developments, faced difficult questions. How could the empire maintain sovereignty while adapting to new social realities? How could local militias and resistance movements be guided without undermining central authority? How could the moral and practical dimensions of opium addiction be addressed simultaneously? These questions underscore the complexity of governance in an era shaped by foreign pressure, addiction, and the emergence of grassroots social action. Amidst these challenges, human resilience remained evident. Families adapted to loss and disruption. Communities found ways to survive and support one another, and local leaders innovated under pressure. The spread of opium and the rise of resistance movements revealed both the fragility and strength of Chinese society, demonstrating how ordinary people could influence the course of history even in the face of overwhelming forces. By the end of this period, China was navigating a delicate balance. The inland spread of opium, the emergence of resistance movements, and the ongoing presence of foreign influence had transformed the social, economic, and political landscape. The empire had to contend simultaneously with immediate crises and longer-term structural challenges. The human stories, whether of families struggling with addiction, militia leaders defending their communities, or citizens adapting to new realities, provided the intimate texture of a nation grappling with forces that would shape its future for decades. As the Qing dynasty navigated the mounting crises, internal debates within the imperial court became increasingly urgent. Reports from provincial governors, local officials, and military commanders painted a picture of a society under pressure. Addiction to opium had spread beyond the coastal regions into the interior, disrupting labor, trade, and social cohesion. Resistance movements, while often small and localized, demonstrated both the determination of local communities and the limits of central authority. Foreign powers continued to exert influence through trade, diplomacy, and military presence, challenging the empire's sovereignty in ways that the Qing had never previously encountered. Within the Forbidden City, scholars, generals, and administrators debated the proper course of action. Some argued for a more aggressive military approach, proposing inland campaigns to root out smuggling networks and assert imperial authority in regions most affected by opium. These voices emphasized discipline, vigilance, and the projection of state power as essential for restoring order. Others cautioned against overextension, noting the limitations of manpower, the challenges of coordinating distant garrisons, and the potential for further foreign retaliation. The tension between military assertiveness and cautious pragmatism defined many of the discussions, reflecting the empire's struggle to adapt traditional governance to unprecedented circumstances. Meanwhile, inland military campaigns were initiated in select provinces where opium trade and addiction had reached critical levels. Imperial forces, often working alongside local militias, moved to intercept smuggling routes, secure key towns, and reinforce provincial authority. These campaigns were complex. Soldiers had to navigate unfamiliar terrain, contend with local resistance, and operate under logistical constraints that limited supplies and communications. At the same time, commanders sought to maintain moral authority, emphasizing the protection of civilians and the enforcement of laws, while avoiding unnecessary violence. The human impact of these inland campaigns was profound. Villages along major trade routes were subjected to inspections, fortifications were reinforced, and travelers were monitored. Families faced disruption, as young men were conscripted into service or tasked with supporting garrisons. Economic activities slowed, as markets and farms were affected by troop movements, and communities experienced both the protective and intrusive aspects of imperial authority. Citizens adapted, sometimes cooperating with authorities, sometimes seeking to evade enforcement, while local leaders attempted to maintain order and mediate between military objectives and civilian needs. At the same time, international pressure on China intensified. The British, having secured favorable terms in earlier treaties, maintained a strong presence in coastal cities and sought to expand their influence inland. Other foreign powers observed these developments, calculating their own economic and strategic interests. Diplomatic correspondence reflected a mixture of insistence on trade rights, negotiation over legal privileges, and veiled threats backed by naval power. The Qing court, aware of the imbalance in military capability, struggled to assert sovereignty while attempting to manage relations with multiple foreign actors simultaneously. Social unrest, fueled by both opium and foreign intrusion, began to coalesce in certain regions. Local grievances against smuggling networks, economic hardship, and perceived corruption among officials sometimes erupted into small-scale protests or acts of defiance. Resistance movements, initially focused on community protection and moral enforcement, increasingly confronted the realities of foreign influence, navigating the fine line between preserving local autonomy and challenging imperial authority. These dynamics created a complex landscape in which governance, enforcement, and social cohesion were constantly negotiated. The spread of opium inland continued to have cascading effects on labor and production. Farms experienced shortages of reliable workers. Artisans found their apprentices distracted or incapacitated, and trade routes were disrupted by both addiction and the movement of troops. Local officials attempted to stabilize economies through emergency measures, reallocating resources, enforcing labor requirements, and incentivizing compliance with anti-opium policies. While some interventions achieved modest success, the scale of the problem often overwhelmed local capacity, highlighting the limits of even a well-organized imperial administration in the face of widespread social disruption. Education, moral guidance, and religious practice became critical tools in this context. Scholars emphasized ethical conduct, the dangers of addiction, and the importance of communal responsibility. Temples and monasteries provided sanctuary, counseling, and support for affected families, often acting as intermediaries between imperial authorities and local communities. These interventions not only addressed immediate social needs, but also reinforced cultural norms and moral frameworks that were under strain from the combined pressures of foreign influence and opium. Meanwhile, the coordination between provincial officials and central authorities intensified. Reports of success and failure, along with intelligence on smuggling routes and local resistance, were transmitted to the capital, shaping policy decisions. Imperial decrees emphasized both moral leadership and practical enforcement, instructing officials to balance punishment with persuasion and discipline with compassion. This approach reflected a nuanced understanding of governance, the recognition that coercion alone could not resolve systemic social problems, and that moral authority, community engagement, and administrative coordination were equally essential. Military strategy continued to evolve. Commanders adjusted tactics to respond to the mobility of smugglers, the challenges of inland geography, and the persistent influence of foreign powers. River patrols were expanded, fortified positions reinforced, and supply lines secured. Coordination with local militias improved, although tensions occasionally arose over autonomy, accountability, and the interpretation of imperial orders. These campaigns, while intended to restore order and protect sovereignty, also revealed the complexity of managing a vast empire under simultaneous internal and external pressures. The psychological impact on communities was significant. Families lived with the uncertainty of both foreign intrusion and domestic enforcement. Laborers struggled with the dual burdens of addiction and economic disruption. Local leaders navigated the competing demands of maintaining social order, enforcing imperial directives, and protecting their communities. Amid this tension, ordinary people exhibited resilience, adapting daily routines, forming support networks, and finding ways to maintain livelihoods despite the pervasive challenges. The human stories emerging from this period highlight the intricate interplay between large-scale historical forces and individual experience. Families struggling with opium addiction, communities confronting foreign influence, and soldiers and militia navigating complex campaigns revealed the multi-layered nature of the crisis. These narratives demonstrate that the consequences of the Opium Wars extended far beyond battlefields and treaties, shaping the social, economic, and moral fabric of the empire in profound ways. By the late 1840s, the Qing dynasty faced an increasingly interconnected set of challenges. Inland military campaigns, intensified foreign presence, social unrest, and the continued spread of opium required simultaneous attention to governance, enforcement, and moral authority. Provincial officials, local leaders, scholars, and ordinary citizens were all engaged in efforts to navigate this complex reality, seeking ways to maintain social cohesion, protect economic stability, and assert sovereignty in an environment defined by unprecedented pressures. At the same time, the international context remained fluid and threatening. British and other foreign powers monitored developments, adjusting strategies to maintain economic advantage and influence. Diplomatic negotiations, backed by military capabilities, continued to shape the terms of engagement. For the Qing court, these pressures reinforced the urgency of inland campaigns, administrative reform, and social stabilization efforts, highlighting the intricate balance between domestic resilience and external negotiation that defined this period of Chinese history. Amid these pressures, the human dimension remained central. Communities adapted, families coped, and local leaders innovated under constraint. Soldiers and militia members performed duties that were both protective and intrusive, reflecting the delicate balance between authority and human impact. Scholars and moralists engaged in reflection and guidance, while ordinary citizens navigated the daily challenges of survival, loyalty, and morality. The interplay between these forces illustrates the profound ways in which social, economic, and political factors intersected during the Opium Wars, shaping the lived experience of the empire. By the end of this period, it was clear that China faced a prolonged and complex struggle. The combination of inland military campaigns, ongoing foreign pressure, social unrest, and the pervasive influence of opium would continue to test the Qing dynasty's resilience. The human stories, woven throughout these events, provide a lens into the lived reality of a nation grappling with profound historical change, revealing both vulnerability and adaptability, disruption and persistence, fear and courage. The pressures surrounding the Qing dynasty did not ease as the years progressed. Instead, the weight of foreign demands, the internal strain of administrative reform, and the relentless spread of opium seeped deeper into the interior, reaching regions that had long remained largely insulated from coastal turbulence. What began as a crisis along the shores of the Pearl River and the treaty ports gradually transformed into a broader national affliction, touching farming villages, river towns, and frontier communities that had previously known little of foreign presence or narcotic influence. As foreign powers expanded their footholds, their demands grew not only in number but in intensity. Diplomats, merchants, and naval officers presented the Qing with proposals framed as negotiations, but backed by the implicit pressure of military capability. The British were foremost among them, but not alone. American traders pressed for equal privileges, French envoys sought expanded missionary rights, and Russian representatives eyed opportunities for strategic access across the northern frontiers. Each foreign delegation carried with it a combination of polite diplomacy and unmistakable expectation, challenging the empire's traditional methods of governance and negotiation. These new dynamics forced the Qing administration to confront questions that previous generations had rarely considered. What did sovereignty mean in an age when naval powers could project force across oceans? How could ancient administrative structures adapt to global pressures and rapidly shifting economic systems? What balance should exist between resistance and accommodation? Within the Forbidden City, scholars and statesmen debated these issues intensely, their discussions shaped by memories of earlier humiliations, hopes for preserving cultural integrity, and fears of provoking renewed conflict. It was within this atmosphere of uncertainty that administrative reforms began to take shape. Some officials argued for modernizing elements of governance, advocating for improved communication systems, standardized reporting, and more consistent provincial coordination. Others emphasized traditional methods rooted in Confucian principles, virtue, moral persuasion, and the restoration of social harmony as the essential foundation of stability. This tension between innovation and tradition reflected not only differing philosophies, but also different understandings of the root causes of the empire's challenges. In the provinces, local officials improvised reforms of their own, Recognizing the severity of the opium crisis, many administrators sought new ways to monitor addiction and enforce regulations. They established regional registries, required village elders to report cases of smuggling, and coordinated inspections with garrison commanders. Though these measures varied in effectiveness, they demonstrated a growing awareness that opium was no longer merely a coastal issue. It had become a pervasive force affecting the heartland, influencing labor patterns, family structures, and community cohesion. The human impact of this spread became increasingly visible. In farming communities, far removed from major ports, villagers began to encounter signs of addiction among neighbors and family members. Some had acquired the drug through traveling merchants, others through small-scale local production encouraged by outsiders, hoping to profit from inland demand. In each case, the effects were similar: diminished productivity, strained relationships, and the quiet erosion of daily routines that had once flowed predictably with the seasons. Village elders and local gentry attempted to address these issues through moral guidance and community leadership. Temples held gatherings where scholars spoke about discipline, filial responsibility, and the dangers of indulgence. Herbalists, believing they could treat addiction with traditional remedies, offered tinctures, teas, and cleansing rituals. Local militias, sometimes acting with imperial sanction, monitored trade routes in marketplaces in an attempt to curtail the influx of opium from neighboring towns. Yet even these efforts struggled to keep pace with the expanding influence of foreign merchants and the growing networks of domestic smugglers. Opium, once limited to certain coastal enclaves, had become a commodity whose distribution was increasingly difficult to control. The empire's vast geography, once a source of strength, now presented logistical challenges. Smugglers exploited mountain passes, river crossings, and forested paths to transport the drug inland. The deeper the substance penetrated into the countryside, the more challenging it became for the Qing to contain. This spread had profound effects on regional economies. In some areas, farmers began devoting small parcels of their land to poppy cultivation, enticed by the profits that could be made through illicit channels. For others, addiction disrupted the rhythms of agricultural life, leading to missed planting seasons, reduced harvests, and weakened community resilience. Merchants found their markets distorted by opium-related transactions, while artisans saw the reliability of their labor force diminish as addiction quietly impaired the skills of apprentices and journeymen. Families experienced the consequences in subtle but painful ways. Parents worried about sons who had become distracted or withdrawn. Wives struggled to maintain households affected by depleted income. Elderly members of the community, once confident in the strength of family lineage, expressed concern about a future in which traditional obligations seemed increasingly fragile. These changes did not occur all at once, but like a slow tide rising, they reshaped the social landscape of regions that had long considered themselves removed from the chaos of coastal conflicts. Meanwhile, foreign diplomats continued to exert pressure on the Qing court. Their dispatches emphasized commercial rights, legal privileges, and expanded access to inland markets. Missionaries sought permission to build churches farther into the countryside, presenting their requests as spiritual endeavors, but recognized by many Qing statesmen as further encroachments on sovereignty. Each of these demands required careful negotiation, as the court sought to avoid confrontation while also resisting the erosion of its authority. At the same time, provincial governors faced the dual challenges of maintaining order and complying with imperial expectations. Reports from the provinces often detailed the complexity of managing local unrest, addressing opium addiction, and responding to foreign influence. These communications shaped the tone of imperial decrees, which sought to guide provincial officials through a mixture of moral exhortation and practical directives. The Qing understood that effective governance required both authority and empathy, though implementing this balance in practice was not always straightforward. The inland military presence continued to evolve as well. Garrisons expanded patrols along key river systems, recognizing that waterways had become crucial routes for the movement of both legitimate goods and illicit substances. Soldiers navigated dense forests, treacherous hillsides, and bustling market towns, attempting to identify smuggling operations while minimizing disruption to local communities. These efforts required not only military discipline, but also an understanding of the cultural and social dynamics of the regions they operated in. Commanders emphasized the need for coordination with local leaders, whose knowledge of terrain and community networks proved invaluable. Villagers, militia captains, and local officials often provided intelligence about suspicious shipments, unusual movements along trade routes, or the emergence of new smuggling groups. This collaboration, while sometimes strained, represented one of the few effective ways to confront the increasingly sophisticated networks that supported the opium trade. Foreign powers observed these developments closely. British merchants and naval officers tracked the flow of goods and the stability of inland regions, seeking opportunities to expand influence or adjust strategy. Their presence, though less direct in the interior, shaped the broader context of Qing governance. The potential for renewed conflict remained ever present, lending urgency to the empire's internal reforms and enforcement campaigns. Yet even amid these challenges, moments of resilience emerged. Some villagers successfully resisted addiction through communal discipline and mutual support. Local leaders developed innovative approaches to managing markets, overseeing labor, and maintaining social harmony. Scholars produced treatises that combined traditional philosophy with contemporary realities, offering insights into how the empire might navigate the complex interplay of morality, governance, and global change. These pockets of stability revealed that the empire, though strained, retained a remarkable capacity for adaptation. The Qing dynasty's survival depended not solely on military strength or diplomatic negotiation, but also on the resilience found in ordinary people, in the persistence of cultural values, and in the ability of communities to cooperate under pressure. As the 1850s approached, the convergence of these forces, foreign pressure, administrative reform, social unrest, and the inland spread of opium, created a landscape of profound transformation. The empire's challenges were not isolated, but interconnected, each amplifying the effects of the others. The Qing court recognized that the path forward would require a deeper understanding of global forces, innovative approaches to governance, and renewed commitment to moral leadership. Yet beneath these large-scale considerations lay the lived reality of millions of people. Farmers struggling to harvest crops amid addiction, soldiers patrolling unfamiliar terrain, scholars debating the meaning of sovereignty, and families seeking stability in a world reshaped by forces far beyond their control. It was in these stories, woven into the fabric of daily life, that the true impact of the opium crisis and foreign intrusion could be found. The next stage of the empire's journey would bring even greater turmoil, as new rebellions arose, foreign influence deepened, and the Qing confronted one of the most turbulent periods in its long history. But for now, as the inland regions adapted to the spreading influence of opium and the growing demands of foreign powers, the empire hovered at the edge of transformation, balancing precariously between resilience and vulnerability, between tradition and change. As the pressures surrounding the Qing dynasty deepened, the empire drifted further into a period of tension that seemed to settle like a mist over towns, villages, and provinces alike. The inland regions, once quiet and insulated from the volatility of coastal intrusion, now felt subtle yet persistent tremors echoing from distant events. The flow of opium continued its steady inward creep, not always visible at first glance, but present in shifting routines, altered trade patterns, and the quiet anxieties whispered within families. The Qing court, meanwhile, found itself confronting a landscape that required decisions at every turn. Foreign powers pressed for new privileges, expanded trade routes, missionary access, extraterritorial rights, each demand wrapped in polite, diplomatic language, yet underlined by an unmistakable sense of inevitability. The more the Qing resisted, the more foreign delegations seemed to multiply, as though sensing the vulnerability of an empire grappling simultaneously with internal tension and external pressure. Within the Forbidden City, debates continued with renewed intensity. Scholars pored over classical texts, seeking guidance from ancient wisdom that had steadied China through dynastic rise and fall. They discussed principles of order, virtue, and the mandate of heaven, striving to understand how these timeless concepts might illuminate a crisis rooted in global economics and foreign military might. Others, more pragmatic in temperament, emphasized fiscal reforms, communication efficiency, and the need to modernize selective aspects of governance without compromising the empire's cultural identity. This divide between tradition and modernization created friction, not merely in ideas but in the very rhythm of decision-making. Officials advocating innovation highlighted the urgency of upgrading defenses, improving intelligence networks, and introducing more standardized administrative structures. Those devoted to preserving tradition warned that a hasty departure from classical principles would weaken the social fabric, erode moral authority, and pushed the empire toward chaos rather than stability. Across the provinces, these debates were mirrored in subtler forms. Governors faced practical dilemmas: how to regulate markets disrupted by opium, how to stabilize communities strained by addiction, how to respond to foreign missionaries requesting permission to travel inland, and how to manage local militias whose loyalties varied from region to region. Their reports to the capital described not only logistical challenges, but also the emotional tensions felt among ordinary citizens: fear of disorder, uncertainty about the future, and a sense of being caught between forces far larger than themselves. The inland spread of opium became more pronounced with each passing season. Merchants traveling between towns observed changes in marketplaces, where medicinal herbs, textiles, and grain now shared space with small packets wrapped in paper or hidden inside baskets of ordinary goods. Farmers noticed new patterns of behavior among neighbors. Those who had once worked tirelessly now took breaks that stretched longer than expected, their movements slower, their focus drifting. Local elders debated how to intervene, torn between compassion for those suffering and the need to preserve community stability. Opium dens, once confined to coastal cities, began appearing discreetly along major river routes and in trade towns connected by mountain roads. These establishments often operated in the shadows behind tea houses, under the cover of night, or in abandoned storage rooms where lantern light flickered against earthen walls. For many families, the first signs of addiction appeared in small, almost imperceptible ways: lost productivity, unexplained expenses, or a quiet melancholy settling into a household. It was a slow erosion, subtle but steady, like a river wearing away stone. Local leaders responded with a combination of moral guidance and practical enforcement. Temples held prayer ceremonies asking for protection from destructive influences, while scholars composed essays emphasizing discipline, balance, and the importance of resisting temptation. Some communities organized mutual support groups, where neighbors looked after one another, sharing information about dangerous dens or suspicious peddlers. These grassroots efforts reflected a deep desire to preserve harmony in a time of mounting uncertainty. Yet, even as communities mobilized, smuggling networks adapted with equal determination. They mapped new routes across valleys, used river barges disguised as grain carriers, and bribed vulnerable officials to allow shipments through without inspection. In regions with rugged terrain, smugglers employed guides who knew every forest path and mountain trail, enabling them to move quickly and quietly. This cat-and-mouse dynamic placed immense strain on local authorities, who were forced to balance limited resources with the expectation of maintaining order. The Qing military attempted to address the expansion through more structured inland patrols. Garrisons, stationed along key river junctions, increased surveillance, sending small detachments to patrol village perimeters and inspect boats. Soldiers worked long hours, often in harsh weather, navigating muddy riverbanks or climbing steep hillsides to track potential smuggling routes. Their presence offered reassurance to some communities, though others viewed the increased military activity with unease, fearing that conflict might follow. Coordination between provincial officials and central authorities became all the more essential. Reports flowed into the capital, with increasing frequency descriptions of smuggling rings, accounts of local unrest, analyses of market distortions caused by opium. The Qing court synthesized these findings into directives, emphasizing both firm enforcement and compassionate governance. Officials were instructed to maintain stability, encourage moral discipline, and strengthen cooperation with community leaders. The tone of these decrees conveyed urgency without panic, attempting to reassure the provinces that the empire remained attentive and responsive. But beneath the surface of governance, deeper currents were beginning to stir. The socioeconomic strain caused by opium addiction intersected with existing tension stacks, burdens, land shortages, disputes over irrigation, and resentment toward local officials. In some areas, these combined pressures created fertile ground for unrest. Small groups began voicing grievances more boldly, framing their struggles not merely in terms of addiction but as symptoms of a broader imbalance within the empire. Foreign powers, observing these tensions, continued to shape their strategies accordingly. British merchants noted fluctuations in inland supply chains and adjusted shipping patterns in response. Missionaries expanded their reach, often establishing small footholds in regions where local communities were open to conversation. Other powers, France, the United States, Russia, watched closely, sensing opportunities in a nation grappling with complex challenges. Their presence, though often diplomatic, carried with it an implicit message. The global world was encroaching on China's traditional boundaries, and the Qing could no longer rely solely on old methods. Despite these pressures, signs of resilience continued to emerge. Some regions successfully organized community-wide anti-opium campaigns, encouraging families to support one another and offering assistance to those trying to free themselves from addiction. Scholars wrote new treatises analyzing the crisis with clarity and compassion, blending classical wisdom with contemporary awareness. Their writings traveled from province to province, inspiring discussions about duty, discipline, and the future of the empire. In certain towns, merchants voluntarily reduced reliance on opium-related trade, recognizing its destabilizing effects. They encouraged the sale of textiles, herbs, pottery, and grain, attempting to restore economic patterns that had long supported local well-being. These efforts, though small in scale, reflected a broader desire among ordinary citizens to reclaim stability in their own way, despite the immense forces shaping the world around them. For the Qing court, these examples of resilience offered both comfort and challenge. On one hand, they demonstrated that the empire's cultural foundations remained strong, that communities were capable of organizing themselves, supporting each other, and adhering to moral principles even in times of difficulty. On the other hand, they highlighted the limits of centralized control. The empire's vastness, once a source of pride, now revealed the challenges of maintaining coherence across diverse regions experiencing pressure from all sides. As the 1850s drew nearer, the Qing dynasty found itself standing on the threshold of even greater trials. The inland spread of opium continued, foreign influence deepened, and administrative reforms slowly reshaped the relationship between the center and the provinces. The empire remained proud, but beneath that pride lay an undeniable sense of vulnerability and awareness that China was facing forces unlike any it had encountered before. Yet through it all, the human stories continued to unfold quietly. Families supporting loved ones in recovery, soldiers trudging along riverbanks in search of smugglers, scholars debating the future of the empire under flickering lamplight, villagers gathering in temples to pray for guidance. These moments, though small, were deeply significant. They revealed the heart of a nation striving to hold together in the face of profound change, weaving threads of resilience through a landscape marked by uncertainty. What lay ahead would test the Qing dynasty in ways even the most far-sighted officials could scarcely imagine. New rebellions would arise, foreign powers would push deeper into the empire's interior, and the opium crisis would intertwine with political, economic, and spiritual upheaval. But before those storms fully unfolded, China found itself in this moment, poised between decline and renewal, between tradition and transformation, navigating challenges with a mixture of anxiety, determination, and quiet courage. As the mid-19th century approached with its slow, heavy steps, the Qing Empire found itself moving deeper into a period that felt strangely suspended between two worlds. The old rhythms of imperial life still pulsed through the countryside market days with their familiar sounds, farming seasons with their cycles of hope and harvest, students memorizing lines from the classics under shaded courtyards. Yet around and beneath these familiar patterns, there was a growing sense that the world was shifting in ways too vast, too interconnected, too unfamiliar for the old certainties to contain. Foreign powers continued to expand their presence, not just through trade, but through influence, diplomatic, cultural, spiritual. Their delegations traveled with unusual confidence, carrying letters, demands, and proposals with an ease that unsettled officials who remembered the days when foreign emissaries had approached China with humility. Now the tone had changed. Their visits held the weight of global power behind them, and the Qing could feel that power pressing at their borders, sometimes gently, sometimes firmly, but always persistently. The inland spread of opium added another layer to this pressure. In regions far from ports, addiction had taken root slowly but firmly, creating pockets of vulnerability where once there had been stability. Villagers noticed the changes first in whispers: someone's son spending too much time away, someone's husband missing harvest days, someone's neighbor keeping unusual company with traveling traders. The consequences came gradually, like a long shadow creeping across fields that once felt safely lit by the warmth of tradition. Provincial administrators, increasingly overwhelmed, reported to the capital that the challenge was no longer confined to trade routes or border towns. Even areas that had once been considered insulated by rugged terrain or distance were beginning to show signs of strain. The Qing court, receiving these reports, understood that the crisis was not merely about controlling a trade, but about preserving the very fabric of society. In response, the court issued new decrees emphasizing moral order, community vigilance, and the need for stronger coordination between provinces. Officials were instructed to strengthen alliances with local leaders, reevaluate administrative structures, and recruit additional personnel for inland enforcement. These measures carried a tone of careful determination, desire to respond decisively without pushing communities toward resentment or unrest. Yet while the Qing focused on internal reform, the outer world pressed forward with its own rhythms. British merchants continued to negotiate for expanded inland access and sought opportunities to deepen their influence in regions unaccustomed to foreign presence. Their activity was not always overtly aggressive, but it carried a quiet confidence rooted in military success and commercial advantage. They monitored river routes with increasing interest, noting which towns showed economic instability, which local officials seemed open to negotiation, and which regions might serve as future centers of trade. Other foreign powers, observing Britain's success, began positioning themselves more assertively. French missionaries sought to rebuild relationships in areas where earlier contact had been limited. American traders made inquiries about river navigation rights. Each new arrival added another thread to the intricate tapestry of pressures surrounding the Qing, creating a situation in which the empire had to juggle multiple foreign demands while managing internal strain. Within villages and towns, the emotional landscape was shifting. Families spoke quietly about their worries, about harvests missed, about sons drawn into addiction, about rumors of rebellion brewing in distant provinces. Communities that had once felt grounded now sensed a faint tremor beneath their feet, an awareness that change was spreading across the empire in waves too deep to ignore. At the same time, in certain regions, spiritual movements began to gain traction. Some emphasized moral renewal, urging people to reject foreign influence and return to strict adherence to traditional values. Others sought a blend of religious teachings, combining elements of local beliefs with ideas introduced from abroad. These movements brought solace to some and uncertainty to others, reflecting the cultural complexity unfolding across the empire. The Qing administration, aware of these emerging spiritual and social currents, monitored their growth with cautious interest. Officials recognized that such movements could strengthen communities, but they could also ignite rebellion, especially when paired with economic hardship and resentment toward local authorities. The empire's long history had taught that uprisings often began not with weapons but with belief, whispering through villages long before the first spark of conflict ignited. Meanwhile, inland regions continued to evolve in response to the expanding opium trade. Smugglers refined their techniques, developing new routes and disguises. Some used rafts loaded with legitimate goods, hiding opium beneath crates of rice or straw. Others traveled in groups disguised as family caravans, carrying children and livestock to deflect suspicion. These operations, while illegal, revealed the adaptability of individuals navigating uncertainty, and the complexity of the networks the Qing had to confront. Local militias, once small and loosely organized, grew in number and discipline. They were composed of farmers, craftsmen, and young men from nearby villages who knew every bend in the river and every footpath through the hills. Their ties to the community gave them a sense of purpose. Yet the lines between legitimate militia and unauthorized enforcement groups could blur easily, causing confusion among officials attempting to maintain order. The Qing military, though stretched thin, continued to patrol with diligence. Soldiers marched slowly along riverbanks, their boots sinking into soft earth, their lanterns casting faint halos of light in the early morning fog. They navigated narrow mountain trails, moving in single file beneath canopies of trees whose leaves rustled with the faintest breeze. Each patrol represented not just enforcement, but also presence and assurance to communities that the empire had not abandoned them, even as threats continued to grow. Amid these unfolding dynamics, scholars continued to write treatises analyzing the empire's challenges with a mix of introspection and hope. They debated the meaning of sovereignty in an age when the world seemed to be shrinking, when distant nations could reach China's shores in weeks instead of months. They questioned how traditional governance could coexist with new technologies, foreign ideas, and global trade dynamics. Their writings traveled between provinces, shaping discussions in academies, temples, and administrative halls. For many ordinary people, these changes felt both distant and intimately connected to their lives. They heard of diplomatic disputes through itinerant storytellers, of foreign ships through merchants passing through their towns, of opium raids through letters sent from relatives in neighboring counties. These stories, carried from mouth to mouth, shaped a collective awareness that something immense was unfolding, something that would touch the empire at every level, from emperors to farmers. Resilience remained woven into the daily life of the people. Families continued to harvest crops, gather firewood, and observe festivals with lanterns glowing softly against the night. Teachers instructed children with gentle patience, passing down lessons that had shaped Chinese identity for centuries. Fishermen cast their nets into rivers whose currents carried not only fish, but also whispers of change from faraway lands. Yet no matter how steady these routines remained, the empire could feel that the world around them was shifting. The pressures of opium, foreign intrusion, and internal strain were converging into a moment of history that would soon test the very foundations of the Qing dynasty. The Qing emperor himself sensed that the mandate entrusted to him carried new burdens shaped not only by tradition and faith, but by a global world pressing inward with unfamiliar urgency. Across the empire, a kind of quiet held in the air, anticipation, a tension, a feeling that the centuries-old order was preparing to confront forces that were reshaping nations everywhere, not just in China. And within that quiet, the people of the Qing Empire continued their daily lives, unaware that they were walking into one of the most transformative decades in Chinese history. As the empire hovered in that delicate space between what it had known and what it was becoming, the early 1850s began to cast their long, restless shadows across the land. The Qing dynasty, once confident in the unshakable strength of its traditions, found itself listening more closely to the murmurs rising from the province's whispers of discontent, hints of spiritual movements gaining momentum, and the quiet but undeniable signs of a society straining beneath the weight of too many pressures at once. Villages that had endured the creeping influence of opium now began to reveal more subtle cracks. The exhaustion of families supporting addicted members, the slow drift of laborers away from reliable work, and the quiet despair of mothers watching sons slip into dependency, created a heaviness in rural life that felt new and unfamiliar. This heaviness was not loud. It did not shout or burst into sudden violence. Instead, it settled silently over communities, like a damp morning fog that lingered throughout the day. Yet amid this slow erosion, there were stirring forces that did not begin with violence, but with belief. Spiritual movements that promised renewal, justice, and divine purpose began to take root. Some blended Confucian ideals with new interpretations of moral order. Others wove together fragments of Christian teachings introduced by missionaries with local traditions of salvation and prophecy. These spiritual awakenings spread quietly at first, carried by traveling preachers and local visionaries whose words resonated deeply with people searching for meaning in a time of uncertainty. Foreign influence, though not always visible in inland regions, cast a long shadow over these movements. Missionaries, while often sincere in their spiritual intentions, also represented a broader foreign presence that unsettled scholars and officials. Their teachings, translated into local languages, carried ideas that challenged traditional hierarchies and introduced concepts of equality and salvation that appealed to those living on the edges of hardship. In some places, villagers welcomed these messages. In others, they viewed them with suspicion, aware that foreign contact often preceded foreign demands. Meanwhile, the Qing state tried to navigate this emerging complexity. Officials issued new directives urging local communities to report suspicious gatherings, monitor itinerant preachers, and maintain harmony. But harmony was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. The pressures of opium addiction, economic strain, and foreign presence created an atmosphere in which promises of spiritual renewal found fertile ground. People sought reassurance not just from the state, but from something higher, something that felt capable of addressing the deep fears that ordinary governance could not soothe. As the influence of these movements grew, the Qing administration began to notice unusual patterns in provincial reports. Some documents described gatherings in remote villages where large numbers of people prayed, sang, or meditated in ways that did not reflect traditional rituals. Others spoke of charismatic figures who traveled from town to town, teaching new doctrines and attracting followers with messages of hope, justice, and the possibility of a transformed world. These stories often came wrapped in ambiguity, part spiritual awakening, part social protest, part response to the chaos ushered in by opium and foreign intrusion. For many villagers, these movements offered a sense of empowerment. a belief that they could reclaim control over their futures in a world that felt increasingly shaped by distant powers and unpredictable forces. And all the while, opium continued its quiet advance. Smuggling networks had grown more intricate, weaving through the empire like a vast, invisible web. In inland markets, traders disguised as carpenters, cloth peddlers, and grain dealers moved with quiet confidence. They knew which checkpoints were lightly guarded, which officials might be willing to look the other way, and which villagers offered sympathetic buyers. Their operations were not chaotic. They were organized, fluid, and surprisingly adaptive. The Qing military struggled to keep pace. Soldiers patrolled longer distances, through forests thick with undergrowth, and along riverbanks where mist blurred the boundary between land and water. Patrols sometimes found caches of opium hidden beneath piles of firewood, inside hollowed logs, or buried beneath grain sacks. But for every shipment discovered, several more slipped through unnoticed, carried by smugglers who knew how to disappear into the countryside before the sound of approaching boots could even be heard. In some regions, collaboration between local militias and imperial troops improved. Militia captains provided intelligence on smugglers, while imperial commanders offered discipline and organization. But in other regions, relations were strained. Some militias had grown accustomed to acting independently and resisted imperial interference. Others had members quietly involved in smuggling, creating a web of loyalties and conflicts that proved difficult to untangle. The Qing court, sensing the gravity of the situation, began revisiting older strategies that had served the empire during previous eras of upheaval. They emphasized the importance of moral education, urging scholars to teach values of discipline, loyalty, and social responsibility. Schools were encouraged to integrate lessons about the dangers of vice and the importance of preserving community stability. Temples held ceremonies where monks prayed for the empire's renewal, for protection against foreign intrusion, and for the strength to resist the temptations that opium represented. Yet, while these efforts offered emotional comfort, they could not fully counter the forces reshaping the empire. Foreign powers continued to observe China with a mix of ambition and calculation. British officials monitored inland developments, sending reports back to their superiors about shifts in trade networks, opium distribution, and local social movements. French missionaries expanded their reach, building small chapels in villages and offering basic education to children. American traders considered opportunities to deepen commercial ties through river transport and inland navigation. Each foreign presence added another strand to the tangled tapestry now enveloping China. Through it all, the emperor remained a symbol of stability, even as he felt the weight of decisions that seemed increasingly difficult. His advisors presented detailed reports, some urging stronger measures against foreign powers, others recommending diplomatic patience. Some argued for military modernization, others for strict moral revival. The emperor read these reports late into the night, often in silence, aware that each recommendation carried risks that could reshape the empire's future. In the countryside, ordinary families lived their lives with quiet determination. They tended to crops that had sustained generations, cooked meals over crackling hearths, and gathered with neighbors during festivals illuminated by lanterns glowing softly in the evening air. They maintained rituals that connected them to ancestors, seasons, and cycles of life that had endured for centuries. But beneath these routines lived an unspoken truth. The world around them was changing in ways they could sense, even if they could not name them. A new kind of uncertainty drifted through markets and temples, through schools and fields, through gatherings where elders spoke softly about matters once too distant to affect daily life. The Qing dynasty had endured droughts, famines, invasions, and rebellions across its long history. It had survived because its people had held tightly to traditions, and because its rulers understood the importance of balance between firmness and compassion, between order and adaptability, between the weight of the past and the demands of the present. But as the 1850s unfolded, that balance began to tilt. Opium continued spreading. Foreign influence deepened. Spiritual movements grew bolder. Economic patterns shifted. And far away, in corners of the empire where belief and discontent intertwined, something else began to stir, something that would soon transform China in ways few could imagine. In this moment, the Qing dynasty still stood, still proud, still vast, still woven together by centuries of culture and tradition. But beneath the surface, the first tremors of a storm were beginning to ripple outward, soft, distant, almost imperceptible, yet destined to swell into one of the most turbulent upheavals in Chinese history. And as China entered this quiet, heavy twilight, the empire unknowingly approached the edge of a moment that would redefine its future, reshape its identity, and test the resilience of every province, every family, and every belief that had held it together for generations. As the twilight of the 1850s continued to thicken around the vast Qing realm, the first ripples of that coming storm spread softly through the countryside, so softly in fact that many people did not recognize them for what they truly were. These early tremors did not begin with violence or chaos. They began with conversations whispered behind closed doors, with small gatherings that met at dusk, with the quiet passing of ideas that blended hope with something far more potent. In remote villages, men and women who had once turned only to ancestral teachings now found themselves drawn to new visions, visions of justice, renewal, divine purpose, and deliverance from the forces that seemed to be suffocating their lives. For many, opium had not merely weakened their families, it had shattered their sense of control. The empire's struggles, the foreign presence, the economic burdens, all of it felt too immense, too distant, too overwhelming for ordinary people to influence. But spiritual movements offered something different, the promise that destiny itself could be rewritten, that ordinary villages could become part of a larger, rising force. Among these movements, one in particular began to gather momentum, weaving its way from town to town like a faint wind that carried both warmth and unease. Its teachings blended fragments of Christian imagery with Chinese traditions of righteousness and moral order. Its leader, a man whose early visions had once isolated him from society, now found his words resonating deeply with those who longed for change. To some, he was a prophet, to others, a rebel, but to the people who followed him, he was the voice they had been waiting for, the voice that named their suffering and pointed toward a future that felt pure, restored, and free. Followers gathered in hidden courtyards and along riverbanks bathed in moonlight. They spoke softly, repeating prayers that promised salvation and justice. They chanted hymns adapted from missionary teachings, but reshaped to match the rhythms of Chinese village life. They trained in secret, not with the disciplined weapons of armies, but with bamboo poles, makeshift spears, and the resolve born from desperation. Meanwhile, Qing officials noticed subtle changes in the regions where these teachings spread. Census records showed shifting patterns, clusters of young men leaving their villages, gatherings too large to be simple religious meetings, supplies purchased in quantities inconsistent with everyday needs. Local magistrates sent cautious reports to provincial authorities, describing movements they did not fully understand, movements that blended devotion with organization, spirituality with the quiet preparation for something more. The Qing state, already drained by the lingering consequences of the opium trade, viewed these stirrings with increasing concern. Memories of earlier uprisings, rebellions that had threatened the stability of past dynasties echoed through the corridors of power. The empire understood that spiritual fervor, when mixed with social frustration, had the potential to ignite a fire that could spread rapidly across provinces. But even as administrators considered responses, the forces shaping the countryside continued to shift in ways that official documents struggled to capture. Villagers spoke of visions, of dreams that told them a new era was approaching. Some described seeing heavenly warriors in their sleep, urging them to prepare for a future where corruption would fall and purity would rise. Others interpreted the strange patterns of the weather-heavy rains, sudden droughts, unexpected storms as signs that heaven itself was unsettled and preparing to intervene. These beliefs were not isolated. They were shared in rice fields at dawn, in tea houses at dusk, in the quiet corners of marketplaces where traders exchanged both goods and stories. They grew slowly, steadily, like roots spreading beneath the surface of the soil, hidden yet powerful, patient yet determined. At the same time, opium continued its silent work. In many towns, dens expanded discreetly, their entrances concealed behind seemingly ordinary storefronts. The thick, sweet scent that once drifted faintly through certain alleys now lingered longer, clinging to cloth, to air, to memory. Merchants, some foreign and others local, recognized that demand was increasing again. Even families who had tried to resist found it difficult to escape the temptation when prices fluctuated downward, or when addicts offered to trade possessions for a single pipe. Officials tasked with suppressing the trade moved between frustration and fatigue, aware that their efforts seemed to slow the spread but not reverse it. Some patrols made progress, capturing shipments and driving dens out of certain towns. But the trade adapted. Smugglers experimented with smaller, more frequent shipments, inland routes shifted, new partnerships formed, and all the while, foreign merchants watched from coastal hubs, adjusting their strategies to maintain profitability without provoking direct conflict. This delicate dance between state enforcement and smuggler innovation created an atmosphere in which neither side gained true control. Instead, the empire lived in a quiet tension, like a vast drum stretched too tightly, vibrating faintly with the pressure of forces pulling in different directions. And in that tension, the spiritual movements, especially the one rising fastest, found room to grow. Followers began to organize more formally, appointing leaders based on devotion and skill. Some were responsible for teaching doctrine, others for maintaining discipline, and still others for gathering supplies or planning routes of travel. They believed deeply in a mission larger than themselves, a mission that framed their struggles as part of a cosmic battle between purity and corruption, between heavenly order and earthly decay. Rumors spread that the movement's leader possessed divine visions guiding him, visions that revealed both the suffering of the people and the destiny that awaited them. Some stories claimed he could predict misfortunes before they occurred. Others spoke of miraculous moments during gatherings, voices in the wind, unexpected bursts of light, dreams shared by multiple followers on the same night. Whether true or simply born of desperation, these stories strengthened the movement's momentum. Qing officials debated how to respond. Some advised caution, arguing that these were merely religious gatherings, not threats. Others warned that the combination of spiritual zeal and social frustration could escalate rapidly. A few feared that confronting the movement too aggressively might spark the very uprising they hoped to avoid. Meanwhile, foreign observers monitored the situation with keen interest. Missionaries attempted to discern how closely these new teachings aligned with their own doctrines, and were alarmed to find that they had been reshaped into something neither fully Christian nor fully traditional. Traders, more concerned with commerce than theology, reported that instability in inland regions could disrupt supply routes. Diplomats discussed the possibility that unrest might pressure the Qing government into making additional concessions. Yet despite all these discussions, the empire's pulse remained deceptively steady on the surface. Markets still bustled. Festivals still lit up the night, with lanterns swinging gently in the evening breeze. Boats drifted down rivers lined with bamboo groves, their oars dipping rhythmically into the water. Children chased each other between rice paddies, laughter echoing across fields bathed in golden sunlight. Life went on. But beneath that life, something vast and unstoppable continued to gather its strength. By the late stages of the 1850s, those quiet tremors had grown strong enough to touch even those who tried to ignore them. Officials traveling through the provinces felt an unusual tension in the air, a kind of alertness that flickered in the eyes of villagers. Patrols noticed unusual patterns, more gatherings at night, more movement along little-used footpaths, more supplies disappearing from markets in well-coordinated clusters. What had begun as whispers was becoming a steady murmur. What had begun as prayer was turning into preparation, and what had begun as hope was evolving into resolve. The Qing dynasty, already rattled by years of opium weakening its foundations, now faced a rising force unlike any it had confronted in centuries. A movement fueled not by foreign intrusion, nor by simple discontent, but by belief powerful enough to mobilize thousands. The empire could not yet see the full shape of the storm forming beyond the horizon. But with each passing night, each gathering, each whispered vow of loyalty and sacrifice, the winds grew stronger, more insistent, more determined to sweep across the land. Soon, those winds would no longer whisper, they would roar, and the dynasty standing in their path would be tested in ways no emperor, no official, no soldier had fully prepared for. The winds of change, though still gathering in the distance, began to carry with them a subtle heaviness of pressure, felt not through sound or movement, but through the quiet intuition that spreads among people long before events erupt into the open. In the early years of the 1850s, travelers moving between towns noticed small signs that life was shifting in ways they could not quite name. A village known for its peaceful evenings now had groups staying awake long after sunset, their silhouettes flickering against lantern-lit courtyards. A once quiet market town reported unusually large purchases of rice and cloth, more than families alone could need. And along rural paths, footprints appeared where few had walked before, forming new trails through fields that generations had left untouched. Too many villages, these changes carried an emotional weight, a mixture of curiosity, unease, and anticipation. They sensed that something was approaching, though its shape remained uncertain. It was as if the land itself held its breath, waiting for a ripple to become a wave. The spiritual movement that had begun quietly, almost imperceptibly, continued to evolve. Its followers moved with a purpose that grew more confident each week. In the early days, they had gathered only to share teachings, prayers, and dreams. Now, they organized drills in secluded valleys, practicing formations and the disciplined steps of soldiers. Bamboo poles and wooden staffs were replaced by weapons acquired through secret purchases, passed from hand to hand beneath the cover of darkness. Swords forged by local blacksmiths glinted faintly in moonlight as recruits trained in silence, their movements slow, determined, rhythmic. These practices were not yet open declarations of rebellion, but they were something more than spiritual rituals. They were preparations. They were rehearsals for a future the movement believed to be inevitably, future in which the empire, weakened by opium, corruption, and foreign influence, would give way to a new heavenly order. The leader at the heart of this movement continued to draw followers with a magnetic blend of conviction and prophecy. His visions had grown more intense, more detailed, more compelling. He spoke of heavenly messages urging him to cleanse the empire, to restore righteousness, to cast out the corruption poisoning the land. And each time he spoke, his followers felt the surge of destiny pulling them forward, giving them strength to endure hardship and courage to face whatever lay ahead. Messages were carried from village to village through trusted couriers who memorized their contents to avoid detection. These messages were not written on paper that could be seized by officials. They were whispered into ears, repeated in quiet rooms, passed on with the confidence that the movement was no longer a scattered collection of believers but a network, spanning hundreds of miles. Meanwhile, the Qing administration felt the pressure mounting. Provincial governors found themselves reading reports that grew more urgent with each passing month. What had started as concerns over isolated gatherings were now described as organized communities, fortified with discipline, armed with improvised weapons, and united under a single charismatic leader. But the Qing bureaucracy, vast and layered, often moved slowly. Some officials hesitated to respond aggressively, fearing they might provoke an uprising where none had yet fully materialized. Others underestimated the movement, dismissing it as another temporary disturbance that would fade like so many before it. And still others, overwhelmed by the lingering challenges of opium enforcement and foreign demands, struggled to devote sufficient resources to a threat that seemed distant compared to the immediate burdens already weighing on their provinces. Throughout the countryside, ordinary people watched these developments with mixed emotions. Some felt drawn to the movement's message of justice and renewal, seeing in it the promise of a future free from the suffering that opium had brought into their homes. Others felt fearful, sensing the danger that would inevitably accompany any challenge to imperial authority. They remembered stories of past rebellions, stories of fire, punishment, and shattered lives. They knew that even the purest intentions could lead to devastation once swords were drawn and armies formed. At night, when families gathered around dim candlelight, conversations turned to the growing tension. Elders spoke with caution, urging younger generations not to be swept away by movements they did not fully understand. Fathers debated whether joining the cause would bring honor or doom. Mothers prayed silently for stability, for safety, for a tomorrow where their children could grow without fear. Even children sensed something shifting in the adult world around them. They saw the worry in their parents' faces, the way voices softened when discussing matters that were never spoken openly during the day. Meanwhile, opium continued to flow, altering lives in subtle yet devastating ways. In some households, addiction deepened, turning once vibrant individuals into shadows of their former selves. In others, the trade itself had woven into the local economy, creating uneasy dependencies between smugglers, farmers, and petty officials who accepted bribes in exchange for silence. The further opium spread, the more it eroded not just bodies, but trust between communities, trust between families, trust between the people and the state. Foreign merchants watched the rising tensions with a mixture of curiosity and concern. They understood that unrest in inland regions could impact supply chains and trade routes. Some even believed that instability might pressure the Qing court into accepting new terms or opening additional ports. Missionaries, meanwhile, debated the spiritual movement's teachings among themselves, troubled by how their own doctrines had been reshaped into something unfamiliar and increasingly militant. Yet despite the complexity of these events, the empire's daily life persisted. Boats still traveled down wide rivers, their sails catching the afternoon breeze. Farmers still bent over their fields, their hands moving through soil warmed by the sun. Markets still echoed with the calls of vendors selling fruit, rice, tools, and cloth. Lantern festivals still illuminated the night sky, their glowing orbs drifting upward like tiny floating worlds. The empire remained beautiful, vast, and alive even, as a quiet tension curled beneath its surface. But there were places where the change was no longer subtle. In certain villages aligned with the growing movement, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. Homes became meeting halls, barns became armories. Songs once sung during festivals were replaced by chants of unity and resolve. People stopped bowing before imperial portraits and instead raised their hands in gestures symbolizing divine favor and heavenly mandate. The movement's leadership created hierarchies, assigning roles that mirrored the structure of an emerging state. There were commanders of small groups, leaders responsible for food storage, teachers charged with spreading doctrine, and scouts tasked with gathering information on nearby towns and official patrols. Their organization grew more efficient, their network more disciplined, their vision more focused. The Qing dynasty had not yet fully grasped the scale of what was unfolding, but those who lived near the heart of the movement sensed that something irreversible was taking shape. They felt it in the determination of young recruits. They heard it in the fervor of sermons delivered late into the night. They saw it in the steady stockpiling of resources and the quiet confidence of leaders who claimed to be guided by heavenly visions. One evening, in a remote village nestled between rolling hills, a group of older men gathered outside a small ancestral hall. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of pine from the nearby forest. They spoke in hushed voices about the changes they had witnessed, about the young men who had left the village without saying where they were going, about the visitors who traveled through at dusk, speaking with local families and then disappearing before dawn. They wondered how long the peace would last, how long their quiet routines would remain untouched by the storm rising beyond the hills. They did not know the answer, but they felt the truth settling around them like a distant drumbeat, slow, steady, growing harder to ignore. By this time, the provinces most affected by the movement began to feel the tightening of quiet lines between those who followed the rising spiritual force and those who remained loyal to the Qing. Families found themselves torn between fear of rebellion and belief in renewal. Young men felt the pull of destiny, while elders feared the return of chaos. The land itself seemed caught between two worlds, the world that had been shaped by centuries of imperial rule, and the world that might soon emerge from the ashes of conflict. Yet even now, the coming storm remained just a gathering force, not yet breaking, not yet flooding, not yet roaring. It continued to build in tense silence, waiting for the moment when all the threads of suffering, belief, frustration, and hope would twist together and ignite something far greater than any single village, any single leader, or any single grievance. In the heart of the Qing Empire, the court remained unaware of how close that moment truly was. For now, the winds still whispered, but with each passing day, their whispers grew sharper, stronger, more insistent, and soon the empire would no longer be able to ignore them. The whispers that drifted through the countryside continued to sharpen, as the months passed, carrying with them a tension that no one could fully articulate, yet everyone could feel. It moved through tea-houses where travelers paused to rest, through fields where farmers bent silently over their crops, through narrow alleys where lanterns flickered weakly in the night breeze. The air held a kind of expectancy, like the moments before a long-hidden truth finally reveals itself. In the villages closest to the movement's rising influence, this expectancy felt almost physical. Children sensed it in the way their parents hurried them indoors at dusk. Merchants felt it when customers asked cautious questions about distant rumors. Even the animals seemed restless. Dogs barked at night more than usual, and horses refused to settle easily into their stables. Something was stirring that didn't belong to the routines of daily life. The movement's followers continued to grow in number, deepening their sense of purpose. The teachings they embraced offered not only spiritual guidance, but also a vision of a new order that promised justice where the empire had failed to deliver it. They believed they were chosen to carry out a divine mission, that their actions were not merely human decisions, but responses to heavenly command. This belief gave them an extraordinary resilience, one that allowed them to endure hunger, cold, exhaustion, and secrecy with unwavering dedication. The leader at the center of the movement strengthened his role as both prophet and commander. He spoke of signs that indicated heaven's dissatisfaction with the Qing dynasty, floods in certain regions, droughts in others, strange patterns in the stars. These explanations resonated with followers who saw their struggles reflected in these natural occurrences. They looked at the empire's faltering strength, at the spread of opium, at the foreign influence creeping across their land, and they saw confirmation that the old world was collapsing and a new one was ready to rise. As the movement grew, its organization became more structured. Leaders began to map out territories, assigning followers to specific regions with clear responsibilities. Some managed food supplies, ensuring that villagers sympathetic to the cause contributed small amounts of grain without drawing attention. Others were responsible for teaching new recruits, passing down doctrines that blended ancient Chinese ideals with visions of divine restoration. And still others acted as scouts, memorizing the movements of local officials, noting the positions of patrols, and marking safe paths through forests and hills. At night, the training continued, now more disciplined than ever. Men practiced coordinated movements, forming lines that shifted in silent unison. Drummers tapped out slow rhythms that guided their steps. Torches lit up the edges of fields as instructors demonstrated the use of newly acquired weapons, blades that gleamed with cold precision, spears balanced carefully, shields crafted from sturdy wood. Women, too, played critical roles, weaving bandages, preparing medicines, storing water, and passing along coded messages in songs that sounded like lullabies to anyone listening from afar. Far from these gatherings, the Qing administration tried to manage the growing burden of threats. Reports from the provinces became more urgent, describing an increasing number of followers, the emergence of fortified villages, and the steady disappearance of young men who once tended farms or apprenticed in local trades. Some officials argued for swift intervention, fearing that hesitation might allow the movement to expand beyond control. Others counseled restraint, believing that too much force could ignite rebellion where there was still room for negotiation or dispersal. The imperial court itself faced challenges beyond the spiritual movement. The opium issue still weighed heavily, draining resources, fracturing communities, and undermining the moral authority the Qing had once held. Foreign powers continued to press their interests, demanding more access to markets and routes deeper into the empire. These pressures created a sense of suffocation within the quarter, feeling that the empire was battling forces on too many fronts, struggling to respond to threats that grew faster than solutions could be crafted. Within this atmosphere of strain, the subtle warning signs of the rising movement often blended into the broader noise of crisis. The Qing bureaucracy, vast and layered, moved at a pace that struggled to match the urgency of the situation. Communications between distant provinces and the capital took time, sometimes weeks, sometimes months. By the time reports arrived, the realities on the ground had often shifted again. In villages untouched by the movement, life continued with a semblance of normalcy. Festivals were held during moonlit nights, with lanterns swinging gently as performers danced in the glow of firelight. Fields ripened with crops that shimmered under the sun's warm gaze. Families gathered for meals, sharing stories across wooden tables worn smooth by generations. But even in these peaceful moments, the distant unease seeped in. Rumors traveled faster than horses. Stories of new teachings, new armies, new visions of heaven and earth drifted from village to village, changing slightly with each telling. Some villagers dismissed these stories as exaggerations, believing such movements were too small, too isolated, too strange to threaten an empire that had endured for centuries. Others worried that the stories were true, that a great upheaval was coming, perhaps unavoidable, perhaps already unfolding beyond the horizon. They sensed that the empire's stability, once taken for granted, no longer felt solid beneath their feet. Meanwhile, the movement's momentum began pushing outward. Followers ventured into new regions, speaking with families who had never heard of their cause, and planting seeds of curiosity, sympathy, or fear. They moved quietly, avoiding confrontation, presenting themselves not as rebels but as bearers of a divine message. Their presence caused subtle shifts in the social atmosphere wherever they traveled. Some villagers welcomed them openly, others regarded them with apprehension. A few, fearful of imperial retaliation, refused to engage with them at all. Despite these varied reactions, the movement's leaders pressed forward with increasing determination. They believed the moment of transformation was nearing. They believed heaven itself was guiding their steps. They believed that the suffering caused by opium, foreign intrusion, and imperial weakness had prepared the land for change. And so, they prepared for that change patiently, methodically. Qing officials, sensing that the situation demanded more serious attention, began organizing more frequent patrols. Soldiers marched through provinces where the movement was strongest, attempting to gather information and assess the scale of the threat. But information was fragmented. Locals hesitated to speak openly, unsure of whether their words would bring protection or danger. Soldiers sometimes found empty villages, places where families had disappeared overnight, leaving behind homes that still smelled of recent meals, clothes draped over chairs, fires still smoldering in hearths. Foreign observers noted these escalations with growing interest. Missionaries, concerned about the movement's distortion of Christian teachings, worried that increasing instability might make their own work more difficult. Traders, dependent on stable routes, began adjusting their plans to compensate for regions becoming unpredictable. Diplomats speculated about the long-term implications, debating whether the Qing state might be weakened enough to require external interventional concessions. But amid all these observations, one truth became increasingly clear. The movement was no longer an isolated spiritual cause. It was becoming a force capable of reshaping the political landscape of the empire. In the heart of the movement, leaders met in secret councils. These gatherings were solemn, illuminated by oil lamps whose flames danced softly against the wooden walls. There, they discussed timelines, strategies, and signs they believed heaven was sending. They spoke of villages ready to rise, of weapons ready to be distributed, of recruits trained enough to form cohesive units. Their leader, calm, resolute, carrying the weight of prophecy, spoke rarely, but when he did, his words reverberated through the hall with a gravity that filled followers with certainty. He told them the time of patience was nearing its end. He told them the suffering of the people had reached a threshold. He told them heaven would no longer wait, and his followers listened, breath held, hearts pounding, waiting for the moment when their preparations would turn into action. Outside, the night wrapped itself around these hidden gatherings, stars shimmering softly above the land that had been home to countless generations. The wind drifted through tall grass, carrying with it a faint sense of anticipation, whisper of movement, a hint of pressure, the subtle promise of change. The Qing dynasty still stood, its palaces glowing with candlelight, its officials working late into the night as they pored over reports they barely understood. The emperor remained a symbol of continuity. The rituals continued. The ceremonies continued. The empire moved as it always had. But beneath that grandeur, beneath that stability, beneath that ancient order, something unstoppable was rising. It gathered strength in the shadows. It grew in the hearts of thousands. It prepared, patiently, silently, faithfully. Soon, the whispers would turn into movement. Soon, the movement would turn into a wave. And once that wave rose, the empire would face a challenge unlike anything it had seen in centuries. A challenge born not only from opium and foreign powers, but from the beliefs, hopes, and desperation of its own people. The quiet night held its breath, and the dawn ahead would bring with it the first light of a storm long in the making. The night that held its breath slowly gave way to a pale, muted dawn, the kind of dawn that arrives without brilliance, as if hesitant to illuminate what has been growing in the shadows. A soft grey light drifted over the hills and valleys of the empire, brushing gently against rooftops and riverbanks, and revealing a land that seemed almost suspended between two worlds, the world that had endured for centuries, and the world that was quietly preparing to emerge. In the heart of the movement, as morning settled across the countryside, the earliest stirrings of activity began. Followers rose before the sun, stepping silently from their makeshift barracks to prepare for the day. They washed their faces with water drawn from wells still cold with nights passing. They wrapped cloth bands around their foreheads, tied their long hair with simple knots, and tightened belts around their tunics. Their movements were calm, deliberate, almost ritualistic. Each step carried the weight of purpose. In one of the larger encampments, instructors led groups of young men through the morning drills. The sound of synchronized footsteps echoed across the valley floor, a soft, steady rhythm that melded with the slow rustle of wind moving through the grass. The trainees' breaths rose in faint clouds, dissolving into the cool air. Their arms lifted and lowered with controlled precision as they practiced the movements they had memorized. Shield formations, spear thrusts, defensive circles, coordinated advances. These drills were not loud or forceful. They were rhythmic, almost meditative, infused with a quiet discipline that had grown over months of nightly training. Nearby, women prepared medicinal herbs, sorting leaves and roots into carefully labeled pouches. Some boiled water over small fires, creating ointments from crushed plants gathered in the surrounding forests. Others neatly folded strips of cloth that would soon become bandages. Their hands moved with a practiced grace, guided by the knowledge that their work was as essential as any blade or shield. They understood that the storm approaching would demand more than physical strength. It would require endurance, healing, and compassion in equal measure. The leader of the movement, seated within a modest wooden hut at the center of the encampment, contemplated the messages brought to him by scouts the night before. Their reports painted a landscape filled with possibility and uncertainty. More villagers had pledged allegiance to the cause. More young men had joined their ranks. More families had offered grain, tools, and safe shelter. But with each new supporter came increasing scrutiny from provincial officials. Patrols were growing more frequent. Suspicious officials had begun questioning villagers who seemed particularly devout, and whispers of imperial intervention reached the movement's leadership with increasing regularity. The leader breathed deeply, closing his eyes as the early sunlight filtered through the slits between the wooden boards of his hut. He believed the signs were aligning signs from heaven that the moment of transformation was drawing nearer. In his visions, he had seen a great upheaval, a cleansing of the corruption that had seeped into the empire. He had seen images of fire and renewal, of suffering and redemption, of a land reborn through struggle. His followers believed these visions were divine guidance, and in their unwavering faith, the movement found its strength. Beyond the movement's heartland, villages continued to grapple with uncertainty. Some communities had already been deeply affected, losing large portions of their young men to the rising cause. Others still clung to the routines of everyday life, hoping that the growing tension would not reach their quiet corners of the empire. But even in these places, the atmosphere had changed. Conversations in marketplaces grew hushed when outsiders approached. Families kept their doors closed at night. Elders watched the horizon with a solemn awareness that the land was shifting towards something from which there was no easy return. Meanwhile, the Qing officials responsible for maintaining order struggled to interpret the reports arriving on their desks. Some described the movement as a mere spiritual sect, exaggerated by nervous villagers. Others painted a far more alarming picture, accounts of armed groups, fortified encampments, and thousands of followers ready to mobilize at a moment's notice. The contradictory nature of these reports created confusion within the bureaucracy. Some officials called urgently for reinforcements. Others dismissed the concerns, believing the movement would collapse under its own weight before posing a serious threat. At the provincial headquarters, meetings dragged late into the night as officials debated the best course of action. Should they send troops immediately and crush the movement before it gained more strength? Or should they negotiate with its leaders in hopes of diffusing the situation peacefully? Every decision carried risks. A premature military intervention could spark a broader rebellion. But waiting too long could allow the movement to grow into a force capable of overwhelming local garrisons. Foreign observers, too, sensed a shift. Missionaries reported encountering villages where the spiritual teachings had been reshaped into something fervent and militant, infused with an intensity that made them uneasy. Traders worried that instability would jeopardize the roots upon which their livelihoods depended. Diplomats speculated in quiet gatherings that China might soon face an internal crisis far more severe than the opium disputes that had defined the previous decades. And through all this, opium continued to flow with its quiet, corrosive persistence. Though imperial enforcement had improved, smugglers adapted with equal ingenuity. Their networks became more flexible, more decentralized, harder to track. They traveled in smaller groups, carrying compact bundles hidden beneath layers of everyday goods. They bribed minor officials, exploited gaps in patrol schedules, and switched routes frequently. The empire felt as if it were fighting a shadow, always present yet never fully visible, always drifting through the cracks. Opium dens had become quieter but more discreet, tucked behind shops or homes that appeared unremarkable from the street. The smoke that once wafted openly now seeped through narrow cracks in doorways. Addicts still surrendered themselves to its dreamlike haze, slipping in and out of worlds where time lost meaning. Families still wept for their loved ones, whose hunger for the drug consumed their futures. And in valleys where the movement had not yet reached, opium's quiet devastation continued to gnaw at the heart of society. The Qing dynasty, caught between external pressure and internal unrest, found itself stretched thinner than at any time in recent memory. Its power still commanded respect, but beneath the surface, cracks widened. Communication between regions grew strained. Local officials took matters into their own hands, sometimes with wisdom, sometimes with fear. The delicate threads that held the empire together felt increasingly taut. Back in the movement's strongholds, as the sun climbed higher, leaders prepared for the next phase. Messengers rehearsed coded phrases they would use when traveling between provinces. Recruits were tested to ensure they could march long distances with minimal supplies. Farmers sympathetic to the cause stored grain in concealed pits, ready to feed the growing force when the moment came. The organization moved with remarkable coordination, each part supporting the others like strands woven into a single, tightening braid. Despite the tension, the movement's followers experienced their days with a strange sense of peace. They believed they were part of something larger than themselves. They believed they were living through a turning point in history. And as night fell each evening, they gathered together to pray, to sing, to listen to the words of their leaders. Their voices rose softly, drifting across the darkened fields like threads of sound weaving through the stillness. But in the quiet hours before dawn, those fragile moments when night hesitates, before giving way to daysome followers, found themselves grappling with private fears. They wondered whether they were prepared for what would come. They worried about their families left behind. They questioned whether the suffering ahead would truly lead to the renewal they had been promised. These thoughts drifted through their minds like shadows, but they rarely spoke them aloud. The movement depended on unity, and doubts were buried deep, hidden beneath layers of conviction. In the imperial palace, far away from these hidden camps and fields, the emperor faced his own sleepless nights. He read reports by candlelight, the flame trembling each time a draft passed through the corridor. He knew the empire was entering a dangerous era. He knew that opium had weakened the nation. He knew that foreign demands threatened its sovereignty. And now, he knew that an internal force born of belief, desperation, and disillusionment might soon challenge the dynasty directly. He wondered whether he could still steer the empire away from disaster. He wondered whether the heavens had turned their gaze elsewhere. And as he knelt in the quiet of the ancestral hall, the vast space illuminated only by the glow of incense, he prayed for guidance that seemed increasingly distant. Beyond the palace walls, beyond the cities and the rivers and the mountains, the rising movement approached a threshold it could no longer retreat from. Its leaders sensed it. Its followers sensed it. Even those who opposed it sensed it. The land felt poised on the edge of something immense. The winds no longer whispered. They pressed forward, gathering pace, carrying with them the murmur of thousands of footsteps, preparing to step into the open. Soon the first confrontation would come. Soon the movement would reveal itself, not as a rumor, not as a whisper, but as a force that demanded to be reckoned with. And once that first confrontation occurred, the direction of the Qing dynasty and the destiny of millions would be forever altered. The dawn ahead held its breath, and the storm, after so long gathering in silence, was finally ready to break. The dawn that had held its breath now gradually filled the land with muted light, illuminating fields, rivers, and villages that had yet to grasp the magnitude of the storm approaching. Even as sunlight stretched lazily across hills and valleys, a quiet urgency pulsed beneath the ordinary rhythms of life, weaving its way through homes, marketplaces, and winding paths between distant settlements. In the movement's heartland, the morning brought a disciplined energy. Followers prepared for the day with deliberate precision, moving in coordinated groups across the mist-laden fields. Bamboo staffs were cleaned and sharpened, leather straps were adjusted, and small bundles of supplies were distributed to those who would travel to neighboring villages. Each action was performed with careful intent, as though every step and every gesture contributed to a larger, invisible plan. The leader, seated beneath the eaves of a low wooden hall, studied maps marked with the positions of sympathetic villages, patrol routes, and potential gathering points. His vision extended beyond immediate survival. He imagined the way networks of followers could link together, forming a web of influence that stretched across hundreds of miles. To outsiders, these plans might have seemed improbable, even fragile, but to those who believed in him, the network was already a living organism, vibrant and unstoppable. Training continued in silence for hours. Men moved with precision, practicing the careful positioning of shields, the coordinated thrusts of spears, the fluid motion of small units responding to imagined threats. Women, essential to the life of the movement, prepared food caches, reinforced storage spaces, and tended to medicinal herbs that might one day be needed in the heat of conflict. Even children were quietly taught observing drills, carrying messages, learning to recognize signals, all without realizing the larger significance of their lessons. The surrounding villages, some aware of the movement's growing presence, remained tense. Farmers noticed unusual gatherings in neighboring fields, and elders whispered warnings to their families. Some communities quietly aligned with the movement, offering discreet support in the form of food, shelter, or information. Others maintained distance, hoping the conflict would bypass their homes entirely. Still, even in these places, the atmosphere had changed. The land itself seemed to vibrate with anticipation, as if nature had sensed the momentum building in human hearts. The Qing administration, meanwhile, struggled with the increasing complexity of the situation. Reports arriving from distant provinces painted inconsistent pictures. Some described isolated gatherings easily dispersed. Others detailed well-armed groups, with a surprising degree of organization. The layered bureaucracy slowed decisive action. Messages traveled slowly, miscommunications multiplied, and the tension between provincial authorities and the central court increased. Every day that passed without direct confrontation allowed the movement to strengthen further, testing the patience of both officials and soldiers. Opium, ever present in the background of the empire's struggles, continued its quiet, corrosive work. In inland towns, addicts hid in plain sight, their dependence slowly unraveling families and communities. Smugglers adapted constantly, exploiting weaknesses in patrol schedules and bribing officials who were too stretched to resist. The empire's attempts to suppress the trade, though occasionally effective, often felt like grasping at shadows. For every shipment intercepted, several others slipped through undetected, ensuring that opium's influence remained both pervasive and persistent. Foreign merchants and diplomats observed the unrest with calculated interest. Missionaries worried about the distortion of their teachings as they were integrated into the movement's doctrine. Traders considered which routes were becoming unsafe and adjusted their supply chains accordingly. Diplomats debated whether the Qing court would be able to contain the unrest, or whether foreign powers might exploit the situation to extract further concessions. In every observation, one theme emerged. China was entering a period of instability that would challenge assumptions, traditions, and long-standing hierarchies. As the sun climbed higher, the movement's leadership convened a council. The atmosphere in the hall was solemn yet charged with energy. Leaders discussed the strategic distribution of forces, the timing of communications to allied villages, and the allocation of resources to ensure sustainability in the event of conflict. Scouts reported the positions of imperial patrols, highlighting gaps and vulnerabilities. Teachers and propagators detailed which communities might be swayed by messages of hope and renewal, and which might resist or betray them. Every decision was measured against both spiritual conviction and practical necessity. The leader spoke sparingly, each word chosen with care. He reminded his followers that the time for patient preparation was nearing its end. He emphasized the importance of discipline, secrecy, and faith. And he reinforced a vision that extended far beyond individual villages or provinces. A transformed empire, purified by divine mandate, where justice would replace corruption, and a new social order would rise from the chaos of the old. Beyond the movement, ordinary people continued their routines, yet even the simplest activities were now tinged with uncertainty. Women drew water from wells with an awareness of the shifting social currents. Farmers worked their fields with a subtle tension, glancing at travelers whose intentions were unclear. Children played under the shade of ancient trees, their laughter a fragile thread of normalcy in a landscape preparing for upheaval. Market towns, once vibrant with predictable rhythms, now felt the faint ripple of unease with every unusual visitor or unexplained disappearance. The Qing military, aware of the growing threat, increased patrols and checkpoints. Soldiers moved through villages and forests with heightened vigilance. Their presence meant to deter but sometimes inadvertently provoked the spread of the movement. Scouts and messengers traveled tirelessly, seeking information about gatherings, the distribution of resources, and potential recruitment. Despite these efforts, the decentralized nature of the movement made it difficult to predict where the next flare of unrest might arise. At night, as torches flickered against the dark, the movement's followers gathered once more to chant, pray, and rehearse. The sounds of bamboo staffs striking wooden shields, the rhythmic beating of small drums, and the quiet rustle of feet against earth blended into a slow, deliberate cadence. It was not merely training, it was a ritual of preparation, reinforcing both faith and community, a rhythm that threaded through every heart and mind. Some followers, quietly reflecting on their role, felt both exhilaration and fear. They understood the magnitude of the storm they were approaching. They wondered if they could endure the trials ahead. They worried for their families left behind. Yet even in their private doubts, they returned to the teachings and the vision of their leader, drawing courage from the shared belief that their actions were part of a higher purpose, a cosmic pattern beyond immediate comprehension. In distant cities, imperial officials continued their deliberations, increasingly anxious as reports became more consistent and alarming. Advisors debated potential strategies should they strike preemptively, attempt to negotiate, or reinforce provincial defenses. No choice seemed without risk. Each delay gave the movement more time to consolidate. Each action risked inflaming unrest further. The emperor, reading these reports late into the night, understood that a critical moment was approaching, one that would demand both wisdom and resolve beyond any measure of the past. The natural world mirrored the tension, as if aware of the human currents gathering beneath it. Winds carried the scent of damp earth and pine. Rivers reflected the morning light with a subdued shimmer, and birds moved in cautious patterns through the trees. Even the mountains, stoic and eternal, seemed to lean into the quiet anticipation of what was coming. Nature, like the people of the empire, waited with bated breath. By the middle of the day, the movement had solidified its networks further. Couriers traveled unseen between villages, carrying instructions, distributing supplies, and strengthening local allegiances. Training drills intensified in remote clearings, blending the discipline of martial preparation with ritualized patterns that reinforced loyalty and faith. Food and medicine were stockpiled, pathways cleared, and signals established to warn of approaching patrols. Every detail, no matter how small, was part of a plan that had been months in the making. The empire's people, even those not directly involved, sensed that time was bending toward something unprecedented. Conversations at markets grew cautious. Elders exchanged knowing glances, and travelers moving between villages noticed subtle signs of preparedness. Hidden watchposts, carefully concealed supplies, and unusual nighttime activity. Even those unaware of the spiritual or martial motivations behind these signs felt a sense of underlying tension, as though the land itself held its breath. As dusk approached, torches were lit across villages aligned with the movement. The soft glow illuminated quiet gatherings of families, young men practicing movements, and women tending to supplies. The sound of distant drums, initially faint, grew steadily in the background, a heartbeat for the network, guiding movements and synchronizing intent. Shadows shifted across fields and courtyards, as if the land were being subtly reshaped, anticipating the events that would soon unfold. The movement's leader walked among his followers that evening, observing their readiness and offering quiet counsel. He reminded them that the coming days would test their resolve, their faith, and their discipline. He spoke of patience, courage, and the higher purpose that had guided them through months of preparation. And though his words were gentle, the power in his presence instilled in them a quiet certainty. The moment for action was near, and when it came, they would rise together, not merely as followers, but as the embodiment of a vision that had been waiting to awaken in the hearts of the empire's people. In that twilight, the vast Qing dynasty still stood, its cities glittering with lights, and its rulers unaware of the full scale of the storm approaching from the countryside. Officials debated strategies, soldiers patrolled with vigilance, and merchants continued their trade, all under the serene yet deceptive calm of the evening sky. Yet beneath the surface, a force shaped by belief, desperation, and relentless preparation was poised to step into the open. The first wave of confrontation, long anticipated in quiet whispers and secret councils, was only hours away. The empire's peace, however vast and ancient, now trembled on the edge of transformation, and in the stillness of the approaching night, the land, the people, and the rising movement seemed to wait together, suspended at the threshold of history, as if the very air held its breath for what was about to unfold. Night had fully descended over the vast stretches of the empire, its quiet darkness a veil under which movement and preparation thrived. The stars shone faintly, scattered like whispers across the sky, and the moon cast a soft, silvery light over fields, rivers, and villages alike. To the casual observer, all appeared calm. Yet beneath the surface, currents of anticipation pulsed through every village, aligned with the movement, every hidden encampment, and every heart that had pledged itself to the cause. In the countryside, torches flickered softly along narrow paths, illuminating groups of followers making their way toward strategic points. Their movements were measured, disciplined, and silent, each person aware of the consequences should their presence be discovered. Messages had been delivered and received, signals carefully noted, and routes mapped with precision. What once had been scattered gatherings now moved in a quiet but coordinated rhythm, a network stretching across provinces with the patience and care of a spider weaving its web. The leader of the movement walked among his followers that night, his calm presence steadying those whose excitement, anticipation, and anxiety mingled in equal measure. He did not speak often, but when he did, it was to remind them of the greater purpose that guided their actions. He emphasized vigilance, patience, and unity. Every whisper of instruction, every subtle gesture, and every glance carried layers of meaning that reinforced both discipline and trust. At the same time, small patrols of soldiers moved along the borders of villages, largely unaware of the network forming in the shadows. Some locals watched silently, unsure whether to intervene, hide, or follow. Others provided subtle support, guiding couriers or offering temporary shelter to those moving through the darkness. The interplay of secrecy, loyalty, and fear created a delicate tension in which each individual choice carried consequences that could ripple across the entire region. The movement's organization was meticulous. Recruits were positioned based on skill, familiarity with terrain, and ability to follow instructions without hesitation. Supplies of food, water, and medicine were distributed along concealed paths, ensuring that even if one node was compromised, others could remain operational. Hidden signals, small arrangements of stones, marks on trees, faint lights in windows, communicated information from one settlement to the next. Every element was designed to sustain the network and protect it from both discovery and disruption. In remote valleys, training continued. Men practiced with sharpened bamboo staffs and wooden swords, moving with a fluidity that had been honed over months. Women reinforced barricades in small houses, tended fires for warmth and cooking, and prepared first aid for injuries that might occur. Children, their eyes wide with both fear and excitement, carried messages discreetly, learning the movements of the network with a sense of purpose beyond their years. The Qing administration, far away in provincial capitals and in the imperial palace, sensed that the unrest was no longer limited to whispers. Reports described villages disappearing overnight, unusual patterns of recruitment, and signs of coordinated activity among groups that had previously seemed disorganized. Officials debated the reliability of these reports. Some believed exaggeration. Some feared understatement, but the growing consistency made it increasingly clear that a significant force was rising beyond their immediate control. Opium, still flowing quietly in the background, contributed to the complexity of the situation. Its spread continued to weaken families, divert attention from local governance, and create dependencies that intertwined with the movement itself. Some villages, struggling with addiction, found themselves more receptive to the movement's promise of renewal and order, seeing in its structure and discipline a possible escape from despair. Others resisted, fearing that alignment would bring imperial retribution or entanglement in violence. Foreign observers monitored the unrest with a mix of concern and calculation. Missionaries recorded the adaptation of their teachings into the movement's ideology, worried about the potential distortion of their doctrines. Traders mapped routes that were increasingly unreliable, preparing contingencies in case the countryside became unpassable. Diplomats debated the long-term implications of an internal uprising, speculating whether it might weaken the Qing state sufficiently to necessitate new treaties or concessions. Every external eye saw the rising tension differently, but all agreed that the empire was entering an era of uncertainty unprecedented in recent memory. As night deepened, followers of the movement gathered for quiet reflection and preparation. They recited chants and prayers, reaffirming their commitment to the cause and the divine purpose that guided them. Some sat in meditation, visualizing the coming challenges, the routes they would take, and the villages they would influence. Others discussed quietly among themselves, sharing strategies, reinforcing instructions, and building confidence in their collective ability to endure the trials ahead. The leader's presence was central to this rhythm. Even in silence, he communicated assurance, focus, and unyielding conviction. Followers observed his movements, internalized his calm authority, and allowed his confidence to steady their own fears. They believed their actions were not only necessary but inevitable, that destiny itself had set them on this path. and that heaven had marked their struggle as just. Meanwhile, across the provinces, ordinary villagers grappled with uncertainty. They observed unusual gatherings, noted the disappearance of young men, and sensed the subtle tension in the air. Families whispered about neighbors who might have joined the movement, about strangers who passed through at odd hours, and about the strange rhythms that had begun to infiltrate daily life. Children played, laughed, and cried, unaware of the historical forces gathering around them. Farmers continued to tend their crops, market towns buzzed faintly with trade, and life persisted but always under the shadow of an approaching storm. The Qing court, sensing rising unrest but still distant from its full scope, issued edicts calling for calm, discipline, and vigilance. Provincial governors were instructed to investigate gatherings, monitor suspicious activity, and report any signs of organized resistance. Some took these orders seriously, mobilizing troops and scouts. Others hesitated, fearing that premature action might provoke exactly what they sought to prevent. The empire's bureaucracy, immense and complex, struggled to respond to a threat that was fluid, decentralized, and growing with quiet precision. As the hours passed, the movement's network tightened further. Couriers traveled through forests, over hills, and across rivers, ensuring that communication lines remained intact. Villagers aligned with the cause prepared for potential confrontations, stockpiling provisions, reinforcing structures, and readying volunteers. Leaders at every level coordinated, measured, and planned, blending spiritual purpose with practical strategy. By midnight, the energy of the night seemed almost tangible. Followers moved with silent determination, the rhythm of their actions echoing the careful coordination that had become their hallmark. Each lantern, each mark, each carefully placed supply or message contributed to a web that extended across the landscape, linking villages, families, and individuals in a collective effort that defied immediate detection. The empire itself seemed to hold its breath. The mountains, rivers, forests, and plains carried the quiet anticipation of a people preparing for something momentous. The wind whispered through trees, brushing across fields and hills, as if carrying a warning, a prophecy, or simply the sense of history bending toward a turning point. Even in the quietest corners, anticipation pulsed. Every footstep, every hush of conversation, every glance toward the horizon suggested that the night's stillness was temporary, that it was a lull before the crescendo of action that had been building for months. The movement's leader walked among his followers one last time that night, observing, guiding, and silently conveying purpose. He reminded them of the discipline required, the patience demanded, and the courage necessary for what would soon unfold. And as his gaze swept over the assembly, he could sense that the moment of revelation, the transition from quiet preparation to visible action, was imminent. In distant cities, the Qing court and provincial governors remained vigilant, unaware of the exact shape the storm would take. Soldiers patrolled cautiously, dispatches were sent to the capital, and councils convened to debate what steps should be taken. But even with their efforts, the movement's careful organization and deep understanding of local terrain gave it a subtle advantage that the empire could not yet perceive. Across the countryside, villagers waited in tension. Followers of the movement held their breath in quiet readiness, and the empire itself seemed poised at the edge of history. The night, heavy and expectant, stretched long into the early hours, carrying with it the weight of events that were no longer theoretical, no longer distant, and no longer controllable by those who had underestimated the quiet power of belief, preparation, and unity. And in the darkness, as lanterns flickered and the wind whispered across hills and rivers, the first faint signals of the coming confrontation were already moving through the land, heralding a dawn that would bring with it the undeniable presence of a force long prepared, long hidden, and now ready to reveal itself. The first light of dawn began to spill across the horizon, pale and hesitant, brushing the empire in a soft, grey glow that seemed almost reluctant to reveal what had been quietly gathering in the shadows. In the fields, rivers, and valleys, the subtle tension of the past months now became palpable, vibrating through the air like a chord struck deep within the earth. Villagers, soldiers, and followers alike felt it, though each understood it differently. Some as fear, some as anticipation, some as the undeniable weight of destiny. In the movement's encampments, followers moved with a quiet urgency. The early morning mist clung to the grass, cooling the hands and faces of those who trained beneath it. Bamboo staffs were lifted and lowered in precise formations, spears adjusted to their proper lengths, and shields tested for balance and strength. Leaders walked among their followers, whispering instructions, observing technique, and ensuring that discipline held, even as excitement threatened to fracture the calm. Every gesture, every step, every breath was part of a rhythm long practiced and now ready to take on its full purpose. Supply lines had been meticulously prepared. Couriers traveled along hidden paths, carrying food, water, medicine, and messages, ensuring that distant nodes of the network were fully supported. Families who had pledged allegiance provided shelter and assistance, their homes quietly transformed into depots of preparation. The land itself, ordinary in appearance, had become an intricate stage for a drama that would soon unfold, its fields, forests, and rivers woven into a living map of strategy and belief. The leader, standing beneath the eaves of a modest wooden hall, observed the morning activity with calm assurance. His presence radiated the quiet confidence that had held the network together through months of preparation. He understood the weight of the moment, the threshold upon which history balanced, and he knew that every choice, every instruction, every small act of discipline now carried consequences that would ripple far beyond the hills and valleys where they trained. In villages across the provinces, ordinary people felt the growing pulse of change. Farmers paused in their fields, sensing the unusual quiet of distant roads and the absence of neighbors who had joined the movement. Children noticed adults speaking in softer tones, in whispers that carried weight they did not fully comprehend. Merchants in small towns observed unusual patterns of travel, the movement of people carrying supplies, and the strange rhythm of preparation that seemed to infiltrate even the mundane daily routines. The Qing administration, stretched thin by the combined pressures of opium, foreign influence, and the rising movement, struggled to respond with effective coordination. Provincial governors debated whether to act decisively, fearing that an aggressive move could provoke the very uprising they sought to suppress. Others hesitated, waiting for additional intelligence that was slow to arrive. Soldiers patrolled the countryside, yet their presence, though meant to deter, was often ineffective against the subtle and disciplined network now forming throughout the provinces. Opium, flowing quietly in the background, continued its corrosive influence, weakening families, undermining communities, and providing both a distraction and a vulnerability that the movement could exploit. Addicts remained unaware of the historical forces gathering around them, yet their dependence contributed to the instability of regions, subtly tilting the balance in favor of those who had long prepared. By mid-morning, the network of the movement was fully activated. Scouts returned with reports of patrol movements, villages ready to offer support, and pathways cleared for rapid movement. Leaders convened small councils, distributing instructions with precision, coordinating actions, and reinforcing the vision that had guided them for months. Every individual, from the youngest recruit to the most experienced commander, understood the importance of discipline, timing, and secrecy. The first coordinated action was subtle yet deliberate. Couriers arrived at strategic villages, carrying encoded instructions for small, synchronized demonstrations of alignment. Farmers joined quietly, adding their labor to reinforce barricades, tend animals, and move supplies. Women coordinated communications between families and outposts, ensuring that every participant in the network knew their role and their timing. Children acted as messengers, delivering information with care, often without fully grasping the scale of what was unfolding. In the heart of the movement, the leader spoke to a gathering of commanders and senior followers. His words were calm, measured, and precise, emphasizing discipline, patience, and the importance of maintaining the unity that had been built over months of preparation. He reminded them that the first actions were not meant to provoke destruction, but to signal coordination, commitment, and readiness. Each movement, no matter how small, would ripple outward, confirming the presence of an organized force that could no longer be ignored. Beyond the movement, Qing officials received reports of unusual activity, villages disappearing, small groups moving with purpose through forests, unusual signals observed along rivers and paths. Some dismissed the reports as exaggeration, but the growing consistency of accounts made it clear that the empire was no longer dealing with scattered gatherings. Something organized, disciplined, and intentional was now moving across the countryside. Foreign observers noticed the same patterns, though through different lenses. Missionaries recorded the evolution of teachings that blended tradition with new spiritual fervor. Traders recalculated routes, preparing for the possibility of delays or disruptions. Diplomats speculated on whether internal unrest might alter the empire's relationship with foreign powers. potentially opening the door for new negotiations or concessions. As noon approached, the first visible signs of coordinated activity emerged. Villagers aligned with the movement displayed subtle markers in markets and fields, flags, symbols, or gestures that communicated allegiance without drawing immediate attention. Trained units performed quiet drills in secluded areas, demonstrating discipline and coordination that reflected months of preparation. The presence of these groups was still small, almost imperceptible to those outside the network, but it was enough to signal that the movement was now fully mobilized. The leader observed each action, ensuring coordination and confirming readiness. His calm authority extended across the network, reinforcing the confidence and purpose of followers. He reminded them that their actions were both spiritual and practical, that their discipline reflected both faith and preparation, and that the first steps of their strategy would shape the unfolding of events across the empire. In villages where allegiance was uncertain, families watched carefully, deciding whether to support, resist, or remain neutral. The choice often carried weighty consequences, yet the subtle signals from aligned villages created an environment where hesitation became increasingly perilous. The quiet tension that had built for months now began to coalesce into discernible momentum. By late afternoon, small units moved with coordinated precision across the countryside. Couriers carried instructions, scouts mapped patrols, and leaders ensured that each village within the network understood its role. The rhythm of preparation became a rhythm of motion. What had once been anticipation had transformed into action, and the empire, still vast and seemingly serene, began to feel the first tremors of the approaching upheaval. Even as the Qing administration attempted to gather accurate intelligence, the movement's careful planning and understanding of local terrain gave it an advantage. The network operated in a way that outpaced the empire's slow bureaucratic processes. Communication lines were secure, supplies were in place, and the coordination between villages, outposts, and leadership created a force that could now act with unprecedented cohesion. As dusk approached, lanterns glowed softly across villages, signaling readiness. The rhythm of movements, marches, drills, preparations created a subtle cadence that spread through the hills and valleys. The land itself seemed to hum with anticipation, the quiet tension of months giving way to the deliberate motion of those who had long prepared. By nightfall, the first coordinated confrontations, small yet significant, had begun. Patrols encountered groups, acting with silent determination. Villagers displayed quiet solidarity, and the empire felt for the first time in decades the undeniable presence of a force that had been quietly building in the shadows. The leader stood at the center of his followers, observing the unfolding actions with calm authority. Every preparation, every lesson, every hidden effort now converged into a living, breathing movement. The first wave of what would become a sweeping historical shift had begun, and in that quiet night, as torches burned steadily across the hills and valleys, the Qing dynasty, already weakened by opium, internal corruption, and external pressures, began to confront a force that would test its foundations in ways no emperor, official, or soldier could have anticipated. The storm, months in the making, had finally arrived. The empire, ancient and vast, would never be the same. History had turned its page. The era of quiet anticipation had ended. The era of transformation had begun.